somewhere in the yellow earth of the Central Plains, a bronze vessel still holds the memory of a dynasty that carved questions into oracle bones, asking the heavens whether the harvest would come, whether the king would live, whether rain might fall before the millet withered. This is a story that stretches across 3,000 years, from those first scratch divinations of the Shang, through the warring kingdoms and the scholars who wandered between them, past the first emperors, terracotta armies standing silent in the dark, and onward to the glittering courts of Tang, Chang'an, where poets drank wine beneath the moon and the Silk Road brought the whole world to China's door. If these quiet journeys through history bring rest, staying close to this channel will always offer another waiting. The bronze vessels have long since gone silent. The oracle bones return to dust, but the story remains, and it begins now, with fire and bone, and the banks of the Yellow River. In the year 1899, in the ancient city of Beijing, a scholar named Huang found himself unwell with what some accounts describe as malaria, though the precise nature of his illness has been lost to time, as so many small details inevitably are. Huang was a man of considerable learning, serving as the Chancellor of the Imperial Academy during the final years of the Qing dynasty. And he possessed that particular quality of mind that notices things which others might overlook, a trait that would prove rather consequential in the months that followed. His physician had prescribed a traditional remedy, as physicians of that era were accustomed to doing, and among the ingredients was a substance known commonly as dragon bones, which were sold in apothecaries and medicine shops throughout the city and had been for quite some time, ground into powder and mixed with other compounds to treat various ailments of the blood and the spirit. Now, dragon bones were not, of course, the bones of actual dragons, as dragons exist only in the realm of mythology and imagination, but rather they were ancient fossilized bones that had been collected from the earth over many generations, valued for their supposed medicinal properties in ways that we might now consider rather fanciful. Huang, being a scholar with a particular interest in antiquities and ancient inscriptions, happened to examine some of these dragon bones before they could be ground into powder, and what he observed caused him to pause and look more closely, turning the fragments over in his hands with the careful attention of someone who senses they may be holding something of unexpected importance. Upon the surface of these bones, he noticed markings, small carved symbols that were clearly not natural formations, but rather the deliberate work of human hands, arranged in patterns that suggested writing of some kind, though writing of a form he had never before encountered. This moment of quiet recognition in a Beijing pharmacy would eventually reshape our entire understanding of early Chinese civilization, though Huang could not have known this at the time, and indeed he proceeded with the measured caution that characterized scholarly inquiry of his era. He began to acquire more of these inscribed bones, tracing their origins through the networks of dealers and collectors who traded in such curiosities. And gradually a picture began to emerge of where these artifacts were coming from, which was primarily the region around the modern city of Anyang in Henan province, where farmers had been unearthing them from their fields for many years, supposing them to be nothing more than the remains of ancient creatures with healing properties. What Huang had discovered, though full confirmation would come only after his death, and through the work of many subsequent scholars, were the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty, artifacts dating from approximately 1600 to 1046 before the Common Era, making them among the oldest examples of Chinese writing ever found, and certainly the oldest that can be read with any degree of confidence by modern scholars. These were not the bones of dragons at all, but rather the shells of turtles and the shoulder blades of oxen, specifically the plastrons, which is the flat underside portion of turtle shells, and the scapulae of cattle, which are the broad flat bones of the shoulder. They had been used for a practice known as pyromancy, which is a form of divination involving fire, and they preserve for us an extraordinary window into the beliefs, concerns, and daily preoccupations of a civilization that flourished more than 3,000 years ago. The process by which these bones were used for divination was both methodical and reverent, reflecting the deep connection that Shang rulers maintained with the spiritual world and with their ancestors, whose guidance they sought on matters both great and small. A diviner, who was often, but not always, the king himself, would prepare the bone or shell by carefully carving or drilling small hollows into its surface, creating weakened points that would respond predictably to the application of heat. A question would be formulated, perhaps spoken aloud, or perhaps recorded elsewhere, and then a heated bronze rod or burning piece of wood would be applied to these prepared hollows, causing the bone to crack in patterns that radiated outward from the point of heat. The resulting cracks were then interpreted by the diviner as answers from the spirits or ancestors, and the question along with the interpretation, and sometimes the eventual outcome, would be carved into the bone itself using sharp implements, creating a permanent record of the consultation. These records, preserved by the particular conditions of the soil in which they were buried and by the durable nature of bone and shell, have survived across the millennia in remarkable condition, allowing modern scholars to read the actual words of Shang dynasty kings and their diviners, to understand what troubled them, what they hoped for, and what they feared. The topics addressed in these divinations range across the full spectrum of human concern, from matters of state and warfare to the most intimate details of royal family life, and they reveal a civilization that sought supernatural guidance for nearly every significant undertaking. Harvests feature prominently among the questions posed to the spirits, as one might expect from an agricultural society dependent upon the success of each growing season, with diviners asking whether the millet would be abundant, whether the rains would come at the proper time, and whether offerings should be made to particular deities or ancestors to ensure favorable conditions. Warfare, too, was a frequent subject of divination, and the oracle bones preserve detailed records of military campaigns against various peoples who bordered the Shang kingdom, including the Qiang, who inhabited regions to the west and who appear repeatedly in the inscriptions as adversaries against whom the Shang kings led expeditions. Questions were posed about whether the time was auspicious for attack, whether the king should personally lead the army, how many troops should be committed, and whether the spirits favored the proposed undertaking. The answers received through the cracking of the bones guided these decisions, and the outcomes were sometimes recorded as well, creating a fragmentary but invaluable record of military history from an era otherwise known only through later accounts and archaeological evidence. The births of royal children were matters of considerable concern, and the oracle bones contain numerous inquiries regarding the pregnancies of royal consorts, asking whether the birth would go well, whether the child would be male or female, and what rituals should be performed to ensure a favorable outcome. Weather predictions appear frequently as well, with diviners asking about the likelihood of rain, wind, or other atmospheric conditions that would affect agricultural work, hunting expeditions, or ceremonial activities. There are even questions about dreams, about illnesses, about the proper timing of sacrifices, and about whether particular ancestors were the cause of misfortunes that had befallen the kingdom. Through these accumulated fragments, we gain an impression of a world in which the boundary between the natural and supernatural was remarkably porous, in which the spirits of the dead remained active participants in the affairs of the living, and in which no significant decision was made without first seeking guidance from realms beyond ordinary human perception. The systematic excavation of the site where most of these oracle bones originated began in 1928, at a location called Yingxu, which means the ruins of Yin, located near the modern city of Anyang in Henan province. Yin was the name by which the Shang dynasty was known in later historical texts, and Yingxu proved to be the remains of the last Shang capital, a site of immense archaeological richness that would be excavated over many decades and would yield not only hundreds of thousands of oracle bone fragments, but also royal tombs, palace foundations, bronze workshops, and countless artifacts of daily life. The excavations were led initially by scholars from the Academia Sinica and continued despite interruptions caused by war and political upheaval, eventually establishing Yingxu as one of the most important archaeological sites in all of China, and indeed in the world. A place where the legendary Shang dynasty ceased to be merely legendary and became concretely, undeniably real. Among the most remarkable discoveries at Yingxu was the intact tomb of a royal figure known as Lady Hao, or Fu Hao, which was found in 1976 and which had escaped the looting that had destroyed so many other Shang royal burials over the centuries. Lady Hao was a consort of the Shang king Wu Ding, who reigned during the 13th century before the Common Era, and she was clearly a figure of exceptional importance, as evidenced both by the richness of her tomb and by the frequency with which she appears in oracle bone inscriptions. Unlike many royal women of ancient civilizations, Lady Hao was actively involved in matters of state and warfare, leading military campaigns against the Shang kingdom's enemies and commanding troops in the field, a role that was unusual enough to be noted with evident respect in the contemporary records. Her tomb contained an extraordinary collection of artifacts, including 468 bronze objects of various types, from ritual vessels used in ancestor worship to weapons that she may have used or commanded, along with jade ornaments, bone artifacts, and other treasures that reflected her high status and the sophisticated craftsmanship of the Shang period. The bronzes alone represent one of the finest collections of Shang metalwork ever found in a single context, and they demonstrate the remarkable technical skill that Shang artisans had achieved in the casting of bronze, using piece mold techniques that produced objects of great beauty and complexity. Lady Hao's tomb also provides a rare opportunity to connect the information preserved in oracle bone inscriptions with a specific, tangible individual whose remains and possessions can be studied directly, bridging the gap between text and physical reality in a way that is not often possible for such ancient periods. The oracle bones themselves number in truly astonishing quantities, with over 150,000 fragments having been recovered from Yingxu and other sites, though many of these are small pieces that preserve only partial inscriptions, and the actual number of complete or nearly complete bones is considerably smaller. Nevertheless, this corpus of inscribed material preserves the earliest substantial body of Chinese writing, predating by several centuries the bronze inscriptions and bamboo slip texts that would follow in later dynasties. Scholars have identified approximately 4,500 distinct characters in the oracle bone script, of which roughly one-third can be read with confidence by modern researchers, while the remainder include rare characters, personal names, place names, and other terms whose meanings remain uncertain. The characters themselves are clearly ancestral to the Chinese writing system that would evolve over subsequent millennia and that remains in use today, making the oracle bone script the oldest member of a continuous written tradition spanning more than 3,000 years. The study of oracle bones has become a specialized field of scholarship, combining expertise in paleography, archaeology, history, and religious studies, and new discoveries continue to refine and occasionally revise our understanding of Shang civilization. The inscriptions preserve not only the questions and answers of divination, but also dating information based on the Shang calendar, names of kings and officials, place names, and the names of neighboring peoples, and a wealth of other details that allow scholars to reconstruct aspects of Shang society that would otherwise be entirely lost. Through these ancient fragments of bone and shell, we hear, however faintly, the voices of people who lived more than 3 millennia ago, asking the same fundamental questions about weather and war, health and harvest, that human beings have always asked, and seeking answers through methods that made sense within their understanding of how the world worked. Huang, who first recognized the significance of these inscribed bones in that Beijing pharmacy in 1899, did not live long enough to see the full flowering of oracle bone studies. He died in 1900, during the chaos of the Boxer Rebellion, but his initial discovery set in motion a scholarly tradition that continues to this day. Each year, researchers continue to work through the vast collections of oracle bone fragments held in museums and institutions around the world, deciphering inscriptions, proposing new readings, and gradually expanding our knowledge of this distant era. The dragon bones that were once ground into powder for medicine have proved to contain something far more valuable than any supposed healing properties, which is the living record of human thought and hope and worry, preserved across the ages in the patient medium of bone, waiting to be read by those who would learn to understand their ancient language. In the soft, yielding earth of ancient China, there lay veins of copper and tin that would, in time, be drawn forth and transformed into some of the most extraordinary objects ever created by human hands. And if you were to stand beside one of those early furnaces, you would see the metal flowing like a slow river of light, pooling into molds carved with exacting care, cooling gradually into vessels that would serve not merely practical purposes, but would become the very embodiments of power, piety, and the enduring connection between the living and those who had passed into the realm of ancestors. And it is this tradition of bronze working, developed over many centuries in the river valleys of what we now call China, that we shall explore together in these quiet moments, allowing the details to settle gently, like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still pond. The story of Chinese bronze begins in earnest with the Shang dynasty, which flourished roughly from 1600 to 1046 BCE in the Yellow River Basin, a civilization that left behind not only oracle bones inscribed with early Chinese writing, but also bronze vessels of such scale and sophistication that they continue to astonish scholars and casual observers alike. And what makes these bronzes particularly remarkable, quite apart from their size and beauty, is the method by which they were created, a technique known as piece mold casting, which was developed independently in China and differs fundamentally from the lost wax method that was commonly employed in other ancient civilizations around the world. And understanding this difference helps us appreciate just how singular the Chinese bronze tradition truly was. In the lost wax method, which was used widely in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later in Greece and Rome, a sculptor would fashion a model in wax, then encase that wax model in clay to form a mold, after which the clay-encased form would be heated so that the wax melted away, leaving a hollow cavity into which molten bronze could be poured. And when the bronze cooled and the outer clay shell was broken away, the resulting metal object would replicate the original wax model quite faithfully, though of course the wax itself was lost in the process, hence the name of the technique. And this method allowed for considerable detail and was well suited to creating sculptures and smaller objects with intricate surface features. But the Chinese bronze workers took an entirely different path. The piece mold technique, which became the hallmark of Chinese bronze production, began not with a wax model, but with a clay model, carefully shaped and decorated with the desired patterns and motifs. And from this clay model, the artisans would create sections of outer mold, pressing clay against the model's surface so that it picked up every detail in reverse. And these outer mold sections, typically made in several pieces that fitted together, would be fired to make them hard and durable, after which the original clay model would be shaved down slightly to create what would become the inner core of the final mold. And the difference in thickness between the outer mold sections and the reduced inner core determined the thickness of the bronze wall in the finished vessel, a calculation that required considerable precision and experience. And when everything was assembled and secured, the molten bronze would be poured into the narrow space between outer mold and inner core, flowing through channels and vents designed to ensure complete filling while allowing gases to escape. And after cooling, the mold sections would be removed, often in pieces that could sometimes be reused, leaving behind a bronze vessel with decoration that had been, in a sense, built into the casting process from the very beginning. This piece mold technique allowed Chinese bronze workers to achieve effects that would have been difficult or impossible with the lost wax method, including sharp angular designs, precisely raised flanges, and decoration that wrapped seamlessly around complex three-dimensional forms. And over the centuries, the craftsmen of the Shang and Zhou dynasties refined this technique to extraordinary levels of sophistication, producing vessels of increasing complexity with multiple components cast separately and then fitted together, handles and legs that were attached with remarkable precision, and surfaces covered in densely interlocking patterns that seem almost impossible when one considers the limitations of working in clay and bronze rather than in more forgiving materials. And all of this was accomplished without the benefit of modern metallurgical knowledge, relying instead on accumulated experience passed down through generations of master craftsmen. Perhaps nowhere is the achievement of Shang bronze casting more dramatically demonstrated than in the vessel known as the Simuwu Ding, sometimes referred to in older scholarship as the Humuwu Ding, a massive rectangular cauldron that stands as the largest ancient bronze vessel ever discovered anywhere in the world. And when we speak of its dimensions, we must pause to let the numbers settle in the mind. For this vessel stands approximately 133 centimeters tall, measures about 110 by 79 centimeters at its mouth, and weighs, when one accounts for all its mass, approximately 875 kilograms, which is to say nearly 9/10 of a metric ton of solid bronze, cast some 3,000 years ago in an era without modern lifting equipment, without temperature gauges, without any of the technological aids we might consider essential for such an undertaking. And yet there it stands, having survived the millennia, its 4 sturdy legs supporting a great rectangular body decorated with the Taoti masks and geometric patterns, characteristic of Shang bronze art. Its 2 upright handles rising from the rim with an almost architectural solemnity. The Simuwu Ding was cast, according to the inscription on its interior, for a Shang queen, one of the royal consorts whose memory was deemed worthy of such an extraordinary memorial. For these great bronze vessels were not mere cooking pots or storage containers, though Ding cauldrons did serve practical functions in ceremonial feasts, but rather they were ritual objects of the highest significance, created to honor ancestors, to serve as focal points for the elaborate ceremonies by which the living maintain their connection with the departed, and to serve, in a very real political sense, as symbols of legitimate authority. For to possess the great bronze vessels of one's ancestors was to demonstrate continuity with the past, to show that the mandate to rule had been passed down through proper channels. And this connection between bronze vessels and political legitimacy would persist for centuries, shaping both the production of bronzes and the mythology that surrounded them. The scale of the Simuwu Ding required an operation of considerable complexity. The scholars estimate that casting such a vessel would have required the simultaneous melting of several hundred kilograms of bronze, using multiple crucibles heated in multiple furnaces, all of which had to be coordinated so that the molten metal could be poured more or less continuously into the massive piece mold. And this coordination demanded not only technical skill, but also substantial labor, careful planning, and access to the raw materials, copper and tin, in quantities that only a royal establishment could command. And this reminds us that bronze working in ancient China was never simply an artistic endeavor, but was always intertwined with questions of power, resources, and state organization. For the dynasty that could mobilize the miners, the smelters, the charcoal burners, the mold makers, and all the other specialized workers needed to produce great bronzes, was demonstrating its capacity to organize society on a grand scale. The raw materials for this bronze production came from mining operations scattered across the territories controlled by the Shang and later the Zhou dynasties. And, among the most remarkable of these, was the site at Tonglushan, located in what is now Hubei province, where copper was extracted from the earth, beginning in approximately the 11th century BCE and continuing for many centuries thereafter. And excavations at this site have revealed a mining complex of impressive sophistication, with vertical shafts sunk to depths of 60 meters or more, horizontal galleries extending outward to follow the veins of ore, wooden supports and reinforcements to prevent collapse, and drainage systems to remove the groundwater that inevitably seeped into such deep workings. And the men who labored in these dark passages, lit only by small oil lamps, working with bronze and stone tools to extract the ore that would be hauled to the surface, processed, and eventually transformed into the gleaming vessels we see in museums today. Those men left behind tools, pottery, and other traces of their presence that allow archaeologists to reconstruct something of their working conditions, though much about their lives remains, inevitably, obscure. The bronze vessels produced from this metal served a variety of ceremonial functions, and over time, Chinese bronze workers developed a standardized repertoire of vessel types, each with its proper name and its proper role in ritual observance. And among these, the Ding cauldron, with its round or rectangular body and its 3 or 4 legs, was perhaps the most important, serving to cook and present sacrificial meats during the ceremonies of ancestor worship. And alongside the Ding, there were the Gui vessels, typically round with 2 or 4 handles, used to contain grain offerings, and the Jiu vessels, elegant tripod cups with a distinctive shape featuring a pouring spout and a tail-like extension, used for warming and serving ceremonial wine. And these vessel types, along with many others, including the U-covered vessels and the Zun wine containers, formed a vocabulary of bronze ritual ware that remained remarkably consistent over many centuries. Even as decorative styles evolved and political circumstances changed, the importance of these bronze vessels in establishing political legitimacy is perhaps nowhere better illustrated than in the legend of the 9 tripods of Yu, a story that circulated widely in ancient China and continued to resonate long after the actual objects, if indeed they ever existed, had passed beyond recovery. And according to this tradition, Yu the Great, the legendary sage king who was credited with controlling the great floods that threatened ancient China, and who was regarded as the founder of the Zhiya dynasty, ordered the casting of 9 great bronze Ding cauldrons, one for each of the 9 provinces into which he had divided the realm. And into each of these cauldrons was cast a representation of the creatures and spirits found in that particular province, so that those who possessed the cauldrons would have knowledge and mastery over all the beings, natural and supernatural, within their domain. And these 9 tripods were said to have been passed from the Xia dynasty to the Shang, and from the Shang to the Zhou, serving as the ultimate symbols of legitimate rule. And while later historical accounts described various fates for these legendary vessels, including claims that they were lost in rivers, or melted down, or hidden away, the story of the 9 tripods demonstrates how deeply the connection between bronze vessels and royal authority had embedded itself in Chinese political thought. Some 4 centuries before the Common Era, in the year 433 BCE, according to traditional dating, a nobleman known as Marquis Yi of the state of Zheng was laid to rest in an elaborate tomb in what is now Hubei province. And when this tomb was excavated in 1978, it revealed a treasure of bronze objects that expanded our understanding of what ancient Chinese craftsmen could achieve. And among the most extraordinary items recovered was a set of 65 bronze bells, suspended on a great wooden frame and arranged in 3 tiers, comprising the most complete and sophisticated set of ancient bronze bells ever discovered. And these bells, known as bianzhong, were not simple instruments producing a single tone, but were carefully designed so that each bell could produce 2 distinct pitches, depending on where it was struck, and together the full set spanned 5 octaves, allowing for the performance of complex musical compositions that would have accompanied the rituals and entertainments of the Marquis's court. And the acoustic precision of these bells, with their carefully calibrated shapes and wall thicknesses, represents a remarkable achievement of both metallurgical and musical understanding. The bells from the tomb of Marquis Yi of Zheng bear inscriptions that provide information about musical theory and pitch standards, giving us valuable evidence for understanding how ancient Chinese musicians conceived of their art. And when modern researchers have studied and played these bells, they have found them capable of producing tones that remain accurate and resonant after more than 2,000 years, a testament to the quality of the bronze and the skill of its casting. And so we see that bronze working in ancient China extended beyond the purely ceremonial realm of sacrificial vessels into the domain of music and court entertainment. That the same techniques of piece mold casting that produced the great Ding cauldrons also produced instruments of remarkable delicacy and precision, and that the bronze workers of the Shang and Zhou eras were masters not only of metallurgy but also of acoustics, understanding through long experience and careful experimentation how to shape metal into forms that would produce the desired sounds. As you rest now, perhaps allowing your thoughts to drift towards sleep, you might let these images linger gently in your mind. The slow rivers of molten bronze flowing into molds carved with patient hands, the great vessels cooling in the earth, the miners working by lamplight in their deep shafts, the bells ringing in the courts of long-vanished lords, all of it part of a tradition that stretched across centuries and left behind objects of enduring beauty and significance. And there is no need to hold tightly to any of these details, for they will be here, should you wish to return to them, patient and still, as the bronze vessels themselves. And so we come now to one of the most consequential figures in all of Chinese history, a ruler whose influence would shape the very idea of what China meant for more than 2,000 years, and whose methods remain the subject of quiet scholarly debate even in our own time. This was Zhang, who would later take for himself the title Qin Shi Huang, meaning the first emperor of Qin, and whose relatively brief reign would nonetheless leave an imprint so deep upon Chinese civilization that we might say he did not merely rule an empire, but rather invented the very concept of a unified Chinese state. Let us settle in and trace the arc of his remarkable and often troubling life, from his accession as a child king to his death on a dusty road far from his capital, his body concealed among cartloads of salted fish, while his ministers pretended he still lived. Ying was born in approximately 259 BCE, during a period when what we now call China was divided among 7 major states locked in nearly constant warfare, a time historians refer to as the Warring States period. His father was a prince of the state of Qin, which occupied the western reaches of the Chinese cultural sphere, in the Wei River Valley of what is now Shaanxi province. The circumstances of young Yingzheng's early life were precarious and uncertain, as his father had been sent as a hostage to the rival state of Zhao, where the boy was born and spent his earliest years. It was only through the machinations of a wealthy merchant named Lu Buwei, who saw an opportunity for advancement by backing the young prince's father, that the family was eventually able to return to Qin and claim the throne. When Yingzheng was only 13 years old, in the year 247 BCE, his father died after a reign of just 3 years, and the boy found himself king of one of the most militarily powerful states in the Chinese world. He was, of course, too young to rule in his own right, and so power was exercised by regents, including Lu Buwei himself, who served as chancellor and effectively guided the state during these early years. The state of Qin had certain advantages over its rivals, advantages that had been accumulating for generations through a series of administrative and military reforms. The Qin had implemented a system of government based on strict legalist principles, which emphasized law, order, and the absolute authority of the state over the individual. And these reforms had produced a highly organized and efficient bureaucracy, capable of mobilizing resources for war on a scale that other states found difficult to match. As Yingzheng grew into adulthood and began to assert his own authority, eliminating rivals and taking direct control of government, he inherited this formidable machinery of state and bent it toward a single overriding purpose: the conquest of all the other warring states and the unification of the entire Chinese world under Qin rule. This was not merely ambition for its own sake, though ambition he certainly possessed in abundance, but rather reflected a genuine conviction that peace and order could only be achieved through the elimination of competing powers and the establishment of a single, centralized authority. Before he could complete this grand design, however, he would face a threat to his very life. In the year 227 BCE, as Qin's conquests were well underway, and the state of Yan faced imminent destruction, the crown prince of Yan dispatched an assassin named Jing Kai to kill the king of Qin. Jing Kai presented himself at the Qin court bearing gifts calculated to gain him an audience with the king, including the head of a Qin general who had defected to Yan, and a map of territories that Yan was supposedly willing to cede. The map was particularly significant because it concealed within its rolled folds a poisoned dagger. When Jing Kai unrolled the map before the king, the dagger was revealed, and he lunged at Yingzheng, attempting to seize him by the sleeve. The king tore himself free, leaving his sleeve in the assassin's grasp, and fled around a pillar in the throne room, while his courtiers stood frozen with shock. Palace guards were not permitted to enter the throne room bearing weapons unless summoned by the king, and in the chaos, Yingzheng could not find his voice to give the command. A court physician threw his medicine bag at the assassin to slow him, buying precious moments, and finally the king managed to draw his own sword, which had been positioned awkwardly at his back, and struck Jing Kai, wounding him severely. The assassin, according to accounts written some decades later, threw his dagger at the fleeing king and missed, and was then killed by the guards, who finally rushed in. The incident left a deep impression on Yingzheng, who became increasingly suspicious and fearful of those around him, a wariness that would only intensify as the years passed. The conquests continued despite this brush with death, and one by one the rival states fell to Qin's disciplined armies and superior organization. Han fell in 230 BCE, Zhao in 228, Wei in 225, Chu in 223, Yan in 222, and finally Qi in 221. With the fall of Qi, Yingzheng had accomplished what no ruler before him had achieved: the unification of the entire Chinese cultural world under a single government. He was 38 years old, and he determined that a new title was needed to reflect the unprecedented nature of his accomplishment. He combined two ancient words for exalted rulers, Huang and Di, which had previously been used only for legendary sage kings and divine beings, and created the new title Huangdi, which we translate as Emperor. He further declared himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, with the expectation that his dynasty would endure for 10,000 generations, each ruler numbered in succession. Having unified the realm by conquest, the first emperor now turned his attention to the more subtle but equally important task of unifying the systems by which the realm was governed and the means by which its people communicated, traded, and moved about. The various states had each developed their own variations of the Chinese script, their own systems of weights and measures, their own currencies, and even their own standards for the width of cart axles, which meant that roads and ruts varied from region to region. The emperor and his advisors, particularly the Chancellor Li Si, undertook a comprehensive program of standardization designed to bind the empire together and facilitate central control. The written script was unified under a system known as small seal script, a simplified and regularized form that all officials and scribes throughout the empire were required to use. This was not merely an administrative convenience, but a profound act of cultural unification, for it meant that educated people from one end of the empire to the other could now communicate through a common written language, even if their spoken dialects remained mutually unintelligible. The currency was likewise standardized, with the introduction of the Ban Liang coin, a round bronze coin with a square hole in the center, a design that would remain the basic form of Chinese currency for the next 2,000 years. The square hole allowed coins to be strung together on cords for easy counting and transport, and the standardized weight and value of each coin simplified commerce throughout the realm. Weights and measures were unified as well, with standard units established for length, volume, and mass, and official bronze or clay measures were distributed to ensure compliance. Even the axle widths of carts were standardized at 6 Chinese feet, which may seem a peculiar detail, but which had practical significance, for when cartwheels repeatedly traveled the same roads they wore ruts into the earth, and carts with different axle widths could not use each other's ruts, making travel difficult and damaging to both roads and vehicles. With standardized axles, the roads themselves became more uniform, and movement of goods, troops, and officials became more efficient. These reforms were carried out with the ruthless efficiency for which the Qin state was known, and not everyone appreciated being forced to abandon local customs and adopt the new imperial standards. The first emperor faced criticism from scholars steeped in the traditions of the old kingdoms, particularly followers of Confucian thought who looked to the past and to the wisdom of ancient sages as guides for proper governance. In the year 213 BCE, responding to what he perceived as ongoing subversion by those who used history and classical learning to criticize his policies, the emperor issued an edict ordering the burning of books. This was not, it should be noted, a complete destruction of all written knowledge, as later accounts sometimes suggested, but rather a targeted suppression of certain categories of texts, particularly historical records of the fallen states that might inspire nostalgia or resistance, and certain philosophical works. Technical books on subjects such as medicine, divination, agriculture, and forestry were explicitly exempted, and copies of the banned works were retained in the imperial library for use by court scholars. Private individuals caught possessing prohibited books faced harsh punishment. The following year, in 212 BCE, a group of scholars was executed, an event later tradition described as the burying of scholars, though the actual number involved and the precise nature of their offense has been debated by historians. Later dynasties, particularly the Han, had reason to exaggerate the cruelty of Qin rule in order to justify their own overthrow of the Qin system, and so the historical record must be read with some caution. As the emperor grew older, his thoughts turned increasingly toward the question of his own mortality, and he became obsessed with finding some means of extending his life indefinitely or achieving true immortality. He consulted magicians and alchemists, and he sent expeditions in search of the legendary islands of the immortals, which were believed to lie somewhere in the eastern seas. The most famous of these expeditions was led by a man named Zhu Fu, who was dispatched with a fleet of ships and a company of 3,000 young men and women to seek out the immortals and obtain from them the elixir of eternal life. Xu Fu never returned, and later legends, particularly in Japan, suggest that he may have landed there and settled, bringing with him knowledge of Chinese civilization. Whether this is true or merely a pleasing story cannot now be determined, but it speaks to the lengths to which the first emperor was willing to go in his quest to cheat death. His final years were marked by increasing paranoia, no doubt intensified by his earlier brush with assassination and by the stresses of ruling such a vast territory. He took to sleeping in a different palace each night, and his whereabouts were kept secret even from most of his officials, so that no one could predict where he might be and plan an attack. He undertook extensive tours of his empire, perhaps seeking the immortals, perhaps asserting his authority, perhaps simply unable to remain still. It was during one such tour, in the year 210 BCE, that he fell ill and died, at the age of approximately 49. He was far from his capital, and his chief minister, Li Si, and the eunuch Zhao Gao, fearing the instability that news of his death might cause, concealed the fact of his passing. The imperial carriage continued its journey, with the ministers pretending that the emperor still lived and issuing orders in his name. To mask the smell of the decomposing body in the summer heat, they ordered cartloads of salted fish to be placed alongside the imperial carriage, so that any odor might be attributed to the fish rather than to the deceased ruler. Meanwhile, work continued on the vast mausoleum that the emperor had ordered constructed for himself, a project that had been underway for decades and which employed, according to later accounts, as many as 700,000 laborers conscripted from throughout the empire. The tomb complex, located near the modern city of Xi'an, was built on a scale befitting the ruler who had unified all under heaven, and included, as we now know from archaeological discoveries, a vast army of terracotta soldiers, archers, charioteers, and horses, arranged in battle formation to guard the emperor in the afterlife. The main burial chamber has never been excavated and may contain wonders yet unknown. But what has been revealed already speaks to the ambition and the resources of this first emperor. And so we may reflect, as we let these facts settle gently into the mind, that Shang, the first emperor, was a figure of tremendous contradictions, a unifier who achieved through force and central planning what others had only dreamed of, and yet also a man whose fear of death led him to increasingly desperate measures, and whose harsh methods planted the seeds of his dynasty's rapid collapse. The Qin dynasty would survive him by only a few years before being overthrown, But the idea of a unified China, governed by a central emperor and bound together by common systems of writing, currency, and law, would endure for millennia, a testament to both the vision and the limitations of this remarkable and troubling ruler. In the spring of 1974, in the flat agricultural land east of the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province, the rains had not come for many months, and the earth was parched and cracked beneath the feet of the farmers who worked there. The drought had been severe enough that the local wells were running dry, and so a group of farmers, led by a man named Yang Zhifa, and including his brothers, set out one March morning to dig a new well in the hope of finding water deeper beneath the surface. They chose a spot in a persimmon orchard, not far from the base of a large earthen mound that the local people had always known was there, rising gently from the plains like a low hill covered in wild grasses and scrubby vegetation. The mound had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and their ancestors had farmed around it for countless generations without giving it much particular thought, for the landscape of central China is dotted with such ancient earthworks, remnants of a past so distant that it had become simply part of the scenery. Yang Zhifa and his brothers began to dig into the reddish soil, which was hard and dry from the long months without rain, and they worked steadily downward through the layers of earth, expecting to find nothing more than clay and perhaps, eventually, the water they so desperately needed. At a depth of roughly 4 meters, their shovels struck something unexpected, something hard and hollow sounding, and when they cleared away the soil to see what they had found, they discovered fragments of terracotta, pieces of what appeared to be pottery of an unusually large size. As they continued to dig, more fragments emerged from the earth, and then whole forms began to take shape, forms that were unmistakably human in their contours, life-sized figures made of fired clay, their features still remarkably intact despite having been buried for over 2,000 years. The farmers had inadvertently uncovered what would come to be recognized as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. A vast underground complex containing thousands upon thousands of terracotta figures, an entire army fashioned from clay and set to guard the tomb of Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, who had died in 210 BCE and whose burial complex had been lost to history, its exact location forgotten over the long centuries that followed the fall of his dynasty. The well-diggers could not have known, on that spring morning, that they were standing above a silent legion that had waited in darkness for more than 2 millennia, patient and unmoving, fulfilling their eternal duty to protect their emperor in death as living soldiers had protected him in life. The excavations that followed, conducted by teams of archaeologists who arrived once the significance of the find became apparent, revealed a site of almost incomprehensible scale and ambition. The Terracotta Army, as it came to be called, is arranged in several large pits that stretch across an area of approximately 22,000 square meters. And within these subterranean chambers stand roughly 8,000 individual warrior figures, each one life-sized and rendered in extraordinary detail. Alongside the soldiers are approximately 670 terracotta horses, their muscular bodies and alert expressions suggesting animals ready to spring into motion at a moment's notice, and the remains of around 130 wooden chariots, most of which have long since decayed, but whose presence is attested by the bronze fittings and the traces they left in the soil. The warriors stand in battle formation, arranged in long corridors that were originally roofed with timber and covered with earth, creating a series of underground halls where the clay army could stand in perpetual readiness. But the soldiers are not the only inhabitants of this underground realm, for subsequent excavations revealed additional pits containing figures of a different character entirely. In one pit, archaeologists discovered terracotta acrobats and strongmen, their bodies posed in positions that suggest performance and entertainment, figures who would have provided amusement and spectacle in the afterlife court of the emperor. In another pit, there are officials and bureaucrats, their robes and headdresses indicating their administrative roles, for an emperor would need not only warriors, but also the apparatus of government to maintain his realm beyond death. And in yet another pit, there are musicians holding instruments, their presence reminding us that the emperor's eternal existence was imagined as a complete and functioning court, with all the ceremonies and pleasures that he had enjoyed during his lifetime. The method by which these thousands of figures were produced reveals a sophisticated approach to manufacturing that combines standardization with individualization in a way that is quite remarkable for its time. The bodies of the warriors were constructed from a relatively limited number of standardized parts, with arms, legs, torsos, and hands made from molds that allowed for efficient mass production. The clay was local to the area, sourced from the deposits near Mount Lee, and it was mixed with sand and other materials to create a substance that would hold its shape during firing and remain stable over the long years of burial. The individual components were assembled and then covered with additional layers of clay that allowed the craftsman to add details and make modifications, creating variation even within the standardized framework. It is in the faces of the warriors that this combination of efficiency and artistry becomes most apparent. For while the bodies follow a limited number of types, the faces display an astonishing variety of individual features. The eyebrows arch differently from one figure to the next, some thin and delicate, others thick and prominent. The noses vary in width and length. The cheekbones sit higher or lower. The lips are fuller or thinner. And the overall expressions range from stern concentration to something approaching serenity. Some scholars have suggested that the faces may have been modeled after real soldiers who served in the Qin armies, portraits in clay of actual men who lived and fought more than 2,000 years ago, though this theory remains a matter of scholarly discussion rather than established fact. What is certain is that the artisans who created these figures took great care to ensure that no two faces were exactly alike, giving each warrior a sense of individuality despite their mass production. The hair of the warriors is equally varied and detailed, with different styles of top knots and braids that indicate rank and possibly regional origin. For the Qin emperor drew his armies from across the newly unified realm, and soldiers from different areas may have worn their hair in different fashions. The hairstyles are rendered with precision, individual strands of hair incised into the clay, and the care taken with these details suggests that the appearance of the army was meant to be convincing and lifelike, a true representation of a military force rather than a simplified or symbolic one. The armor worn by the warriors also varies according to rank and function, with some figures wearing elaborate plate armor with riveted studs, while others are dressed in simpler tunics. And the generals are distinguished by their more ornate attire and their commanding postures. When the first terracotta figures were exposed to the air after their long burial, archaeologists witnessed something that must have been both wondrous and heartbreaking. For the warriors had originally been painted in vivid colors that brought them to life with a vividness we can now only imagine. The pigments had survived the centuries in the sealed environment of the pits, protected from light and air, and for a brief time after excavation, traces of these colors were visible on the clay surfaces. There were deep reds and vibrant greens, rich purples and bright pinks, colors that adorn the faces, the armor, the clothing, and the hair of the figures, transforming them from monochrome statues into something approaching living presences. But exposure to the air caused the lacquer layer beneath the pigments to curl and flake away within minutes, taking the paint with it and leaving the terracotta in its now familiar earthen tones. This loss has made the preservation and study of the original coloration a significant challenge, and archaeologists have developed techniques to stabilize newly excavated fragments, though much of the color was lost before these methods were in place. Among the most remarkable findings from the excavations are the weapons that the terracotta soldiers once held. Bronze swords and spears and crossbow components that were found scattered throughout the pits, having fallen from the hands of the figures when the wooden shafts decayed. These bronze weapons, after more than 2,200 years buried in the earth, were found to be still remarkably sharp, their edges capable of cutting paper, their surfaces largely free of the corrosion that one might expect from such ancient metal objects. Analysis of the bronze revealed the presence of a chromium oxide coating on the surfaces of the blades, a protective layer that had prevented rust and preserved the sharpness of the weapons across the millennia. This anti-corrosion technology was not developed in the Western world until the modern era, and its presence on these ancient Chinese weapons suggests a level of metallurgical sophistication that continues to impress scholars and scientists who study the site. The crossbow triggers found at the site are particularly noteworthy for what they reveal about Qin manufacturing practices. For these small bronze mechanisms, essential for the functioning of the crossbows that were among the most effective weapons of the Qin military, were produced with a precision that allowed for interchangeable parts. Each trigger mechanism is made up of several components that fit together with remarkable accuracy, and the standardization was such that parts from one trigger could be swapped with parts from another without affecting the function of the weapon. This interchangeability meant that damaged crossbows could be repaired quickly on the battlefield, with replacement parts fitting seamlessly into the mechanisms, and it speaks to an understanding of standardized manufacturing that anticipates principles often associated with the Industrial Revolution by many centuries. The excavated pits, as extraordinary as they are, represent only a portion of the burial complex. For the main tomb mound itself remains largely unexcavated, rising some 50 meters above the surrounding plain and covering an area of considerable extent. Ancient historical records, particularly those written by the historian Sima Qian, roughly a century after the emperor's death, describe the contents of this central tomb in terms that seem almost fantastical. Sima Qian wrote that the underground palace contained a representation of the entire realm, with rivers and seas of mercury that flowed through mechanisms designed to keep the liquid metal in constant motion, and a ceiling decorated with pearls and gems to represent the stars and constellations of the heavens. For many years, these descriptions were regarded as poetic exaggeration or legendary embellishment, the kind of grandiose claims that ancient historians might make to emphasize the power and ambition of an emperor. However, scientific tests conducted on the soil of the tomb mound have revealed mercury concentrations approximately 100 times higher than would be expected in normal soil, with the highest levels found in the areas corresponding to where rivers would be located if the historical accounts were accurate. This geochemical evidence strongly suggests that the descriptions provided by Sima Qian, however extraordinary they may seem, have a basis in reality, and that the tomb may indeed contain the rivers of mercury that the ancient historian described. The decision not to excavate the main tomb has been made partly out of respect for the site, and partly due to concerns about the preservation challenges that would be involved. For the experiences with the painted surfaces of the terracotta warriors have demonstrated how quickly irreplaceable elements can be lost when exposed to modern conditions. And so, the terracotta army stands today in its partially excavated state, a silent legion of clay soldiers who have guarded their emperor through the rise and fall of dynasties. through centuries of war and peace, through the long forgetting that buried even the location of this vast undertaking. The farmers who set out to dig a well on that dry morning in 1974 could not have imagined what lay beneath their feet, just as the craftsmen who shaped these figures more than 2,000 years ago could not have imagined that their work would eventually be seen by millions of visitors from across the world, or that the silent army they created would become one of the most recognized symbols of ancient Chinese civilization. In the year 138 before the Common Era, a young diplomat named Zhang Qian set out from the Han court on a journey that would take him far beyond the borders of the Chinese world, into territories that no official envoy had ever documented, and through lands that existed only as rumors and fragments of travelers' tales in the imperial archives. The Emperor Wu, who ruled during one of the most expansive periods of the Han Dynasty, had selected Zhang Qian for a diplomatic mission of considerable delicacy, hoping to forge an alliance with a displaced nomadic people known as the Yuezhi, who had been driven westward by the powerful Xiongnu Confederation that troubled China's northern frontiers. It was believed that the Yuezhi, having suffered greatly at the hands of the Xiongnu, might welcome an opportunity to join forces with the Han against their common enemy. And so Zhang Qian departed with a retinue of about 100 men, carrying gifts and documents of state, heading into the vast and uncertain geography of Central Asia. The journey did not proceed as anyone might have hoped, for within a relatively short distance of his departure, Zhang Qian and his companions were captured by Xiongnu forces, who recognized immediately the diplomatic nature of the mission and the value of detaining such an envoy. What followed was a period of captivity that stretched across 10 years, during which Zhang Qian lived among the Xiongnu, learned their customs and their language, and even married a Xiongnu woman who bore him a son. The years passed slowly on the steppe, and the original purpose of his mission might have faded entirely into impossibility. But Zhang Qian held on to his diplomatic credentials and waited for an opportunity to continue his journey. Eventually, after a decade of patient waiting, he managed to escape and pressed onward to the west, determined still to locate the Yuezhi and deliver the emperor's proposal. When he finally reached the Yuezhi, who had by then settled in the fertile lands of Bactria, in the region we now associate with Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, Zhang Qian discovered that their circumstances had changed considerably. The Yuezhi had established themselves comfortably in their new territory, growing prosperous from trade and agriculture, and they showed little enthusiasm for reopening old conflicts with the Xiongnu, who were now very far away indeed. The diplomatic mission, in its original purpose, could be considered a failure, for no military alliance was formed, and the Yuezhi politely declined the emperor's invitation to join in warfare. But Zhang Qian, being a careful observer and a thorough diplomat, used his time among these Western peoples to gather intelligence of a different and ultimately far more valuable kind. He learnt of kingdoms and peoples that the Chinese court had never heard of, places with strange names and unfamiliar customs, lands where different crops grew and different animals were raised. He observed the magnificent horses of the Fergana Valley, which the Chinese would later call the heavenly horses, creatures of extraordinary endurance and beauty that were said to sweat blood when they ran, though this peculiar phenomenon was likely caused by a skin parasite common to the region rather than any supernatural quality. These horses were larger and stronger than the ponies available in China, and Zhang Qian recognized immediately their potential value for cavalry warfare against the mounted Xiongnu. He also took note of the grapes that grew abundantly in the western regions, a fruit unknown to Chinese agriculture at that time, and the alfalfa that provided such excellent fodder for horses, allowing the Fergana breeders to raise such superior animals. The return journey proved nearly as eventful as the outward trip, for Zhang Qian was captured once again by the Xiongnu and held for another year before escaping during a period of internal conflict among his captors. When he finally arrived back at the Han court in 125 before the Common Era, only he and one other member of his original retinue of 100 had survived the journey. He had been away for 13 years, and the Emperor Wu received him with great interest, eager to hear everything he had learned about the western regions. Zhang Qian's reports transformed Chinese understanding of the world beyond their borders, revealing that sophisticated civilizations existed far to the west, that valuable goods could be obtained through trade with these distant peoples, and that strategic advantages might be gained by establishing regular contact with the kingdoms of Central Asia. The intelligence that Zhang Qian brought back set in motion a gradual expansion of Chinese influence westward, and over the following decades, trade routes began to solidify along the paths that merchants and diplomats had tentatively explored. The city of Chang'an, which served as the capital of the Han Dynasty, became the eastern terminus of what we now call the Silk Roads, though the people of that era did not use such a name and simply understood these routes as the paths by which goods and people moved between east and west. Chang'an itself was an enormous city, one of the largest in the ancient world, with walls that enclosed an area of considerable size and streets laid out in a careful grid pattern. The western market of Chang'an occupied a particularly important place in this commercial geography, serving as the primary point of exchange for foreign goods and foreign merchants. A vast marketplace where one might hear languages from across the known world and purchase items that had traveled thousands of kilometers to reach this urban center. From Chang'an, the routes stretched westward through the narrow corridor of the Hex Sea, passing through a series of oasis cities that served as essential stopping points for caravans. The first major settlement along this path was Huang, located at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, where travelers might rest and resupply before facing the most challenging portion of the journey. Huang would later become famous for its cave temples, where Buddhist art and manuscripts accumulated over centuries. But in the earlier periods of the trade routes, it functioned primarily as a garrison town and commercial way station. Beyond Dunhuang, the routes divided around the Taklamakan, some caravans following the northern edge through Turpan, where underground irrigation channels called carets allowed agriculture to flourish in an otherwise impossibly arid environment, and others taking the southern path through smaller oases that clung to the foothills of the Kunlun Mountains. The paths converged again at Kashgar, another essential oasis city located at the western end of the Taklamakan, from which travelers could continue across the mountain passes into the valleys of Central Asia. Samarkand lay further along, in the heartland of a region that would become synonymous with the overland trade, a city of remarkable prosperity and cultural sophistication that served as a meeting point for merchants traveling in all directions. These oasis cities were not merely stopping points, but centers of culture and production in their own right, places where ideas and technologies mingled and transformed, where local artisans developed distinctive styles by combining influences from both East and West. The goods that moved along these routes were extraordinary in their variety and value, but none was more important or more closely associated with China than silk. The production of silk fabric remained a closely guarded secret for centuries, and the Chinese authorities understood well the commercial advantage that this monopoly provided. The entire process, from the cultivation of mulberry trees, whose leaves fed the silkworms, to the careful tending of the caterpillars themselves, to the unwinding of the delicate threads from the cocoons and the weaving of the finished fabric, was a specialized knowledge that the Chinese guarded with remarkable determination. The penalties for smuggling silkworm eggs or cocoons out of China were severe, including execution, and these laws were enforced with sufficient rigor that the secret remained contained for many centuries. The eventual transmission of sericulture to the West became the subject of various legends, the most famous of which concerns Byzantine monks who allegedly smuggled silkworm eggs out of China in hollow bamboo canes, arriving in Constantinople in approximately 552 of the Common Era. Whether this particular story is accurate in its details remains uncertain, as such tales tend to accumulate embellishments over time. But the basic fact of the technology's eventual spread to the Mediterranean world is well established. For many centuries before this transfer, however, Chinese silk commanded extraordinary prices in distant markets, and Roman consumers developed such an appetite for the fabric that moralists complained about the decadence it represented and the vast sums of gold that flowed eastward to pay for it. In exchange for silk and other Chinese goods such as lacquerware and, later, paper, merchants brought back to China an array of products from the western regions. Roman glass, with its clarity and delicacy, was highly prized, as were the spices that came from India and the lands further south, including pepper and cinnamon and other aromatics that found their way into Chinese cuisine and medicine. The horses of Fergana remained a consistent object of Chinese desire, and military expeditions were mounted specifically to secure access to these valuable animals, which was seen as essential to maintaining parity with the mounted nomads of the steppe. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the trade along these routes had become dominated by a particular group of merchants known as the Sogdians, who came from the region around Samarkand and established networks that stretched across the entire breadth of Central Asia. The Sogdians were remarkable in their commercial sophistication, developing systems of credit and correspondence that allowed them to conduct business across vast distances, maintaining communities of traders in cities from Chang'an to the edge of the Byzantine world. They learnt multiple languages as a matter of course, adapted to the customs of the various peoples among whom they lived, and served as cultural intermediaries as well as commercial agents. Their letters, some of which have survived in archaeological discoveries, reveal the practical concerns of merchants separated by thousands of kilometers from their families and business partners, discussing prices and debts and the difficulties of long-distance communication. Along with material goods, the Silk Roads carried ideas and beliefs, and perhaps no transmission was more significant for Chinese history than the arrival of Buddhism from its homeland in India. The teachings of the Buddha reached China gradually, filtering along the trade routes through Central Asian intermediaries, and by the 1st century of the Common Era, small communities of Buddhists had established themselves in Chinese cities. The translation of Buddhist scriptures from Sanskrit and other Indian languages into Chinese proved to be an enormous undertaking, requiring scholars who understood both the source languages and the philosophical terminology necessary to render complex ideas into a new linguistic context. One of the most important figures in this translation project was Kumarajiva, a monk of mixed parentage who was born in Kucha, one of the oasis kingdoms of the Tarim Basin, and who eventually came to Chang'an in 401 of the Common Era. Kumarajiva had spent years studying Buddhist philosophy in Kashmir and other centers of learning, and his command of both Sanskrit and Chinese made him uniquely qualified to undertake the translation of major Buddhist texts. Under imperial patronage, he established a translation bureau in Chang'an, where teams of scholars worked to render the sutras into elegant and accurate Chinese, and the versions produced under his direction remained standard texts for centuries afterward. The arrival of Buddhism transformed Chinese culture in profound ways, influencing art and architecture, literature, and philosophy, and eventually becoming one of the three teachings that shaped Chinese civilization alongside Confucianism and Taoism. The routes that Zhang Qian first explored in his diplomatic mission thus became channels for a remarkable exchange that continued for many centuries, adapting to political changes and shifting to accommodate new powers as they rose and fell along the way. The physical act of crossing these vast distances remained arduous throughout, involving weeks and months of travel through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. But the rewards were sufficient to draw merchants and missionaries, diplomats and adventurers, along paths that gradually became grooved into the landscape and the habits of peoples across half a continent. The Han Dynasty stretches across more than 400 years of Chinese history, beginning in 206 before the Common Era and continuing until 220 of the Common Era. And during this remarkably long period, the empire grew to encompass a population that would have seemed almost unimaginable to earlier generations, reaching by the census conducted in the second year of the Common Era a total of 57.6 million people living within its borders, an extraordinary number of individuals going about their daily lives in villages and towns and cities scattered across the vast territories that the Han emperors had brought under their administration, farming the land and raising families and participating in the rhythms of a civilization that was developing new technologies and new ways of organizing society at a pace that would leave lasting impressions on the centuries to come. The founder of this dynasty emerged from humble origins, a man named Liu Bang, who had served as a minor local official before the chaos of rebellion swept him into a position of unexpected prominence, and after years of warfare, he established himself as the first emperor of the Han. Though the early decades of the dynasty were marked by considerable turbulence and the careful navigation of powerful factions at court, including the influence of the Empress consort and her family, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Han history as the relatives of empresses sought to consolidate their own positions, and the emperors worked to balance competing interests among the nobility and the growing class of educated administrators who staffed the expanding bureaucracy. Among the most consequential of these early power struggles was the regency of Empress Dowager Lu, who effectively controlled the government from 195 before the Common Era until her death in 180 before the Common Era, a period of 15 years during which she demonstrated a capacity for political maneuvering that was matched by a willingness to eliminate those she perceived as threats to her position or to the futures of her family members. And the historical records preserve accounts of her treatment of rivals that reveal the dangerous atmosphere of the early Han court, including her particularly cruel punishment of Lady Qi, a concubine who had been favored by the first emperor and whose son had nearly been named heir instead of the Empress Dowager's own child. And after the emperor's death, the Empress Dowager is recorded to have had Lady Qi's hands and feet amputated, her eyes gouged out, her ears burned, and her throat damaged so that she could not speak, keeping her alive in this mutilated state and displaying her as what the sources call a human swine, an act of vengeance so extreme that even the Empress Dowager's own son, upon seeing what had been done, was reported to have fallen ill from the shock and declared himself unable to continue governing, though the Empress Dowager continued her rule regardless. The dynasty eventually settled into more stable patterns of governance, and by the time of Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 before the Common Era until 87 before the Common Era, the Han state had developed into a sophisticated administrative apparatus that would serve as a model for subsequent Chinese governments for more than 2,000 years. And it was during this long reign of more than 50 years that some of the most distinctive features of imperial Chinese governance were established, including the formal adoption of Confucianism as the official state philosophy and the creation of institutions designed to train and select officials based on their knowledge of the classical texts, rather than solely on the basis of noble birth or military achievement. In 124 before the Common Era, Emperor Wu established the Imperial University, an institution devoted to the study and teaching of the Confucian classics, where students would immerse themselves in the careful reading of ancient texts believed to contain the wisdom necessary for proper governance. And these students, having demonstrated their mastery of the classics through examination, would then be eligible for appointment to positions in the imperial bureaucracy, creating a pathway by which young men of relatively modest backgrounds might rise to positions of considerable influence, if they possessed the intellectual abilities and the dedication required to master the demanding curriculum. And while the examination system of the Han was considerably less elaborate than the civil service examinations that would develop in later dynasties, it nonetheless represented a significant innovation in the selection of government officials, establishing the principle that demonstrated knowledge and ability should play a role in determining who held power, alongside the traditional considerations of family connection and personal favor. The 57 million people recorded in that census of the second year of the Common Era were overwhelmingly engaged in agriculture, as would remain the case throughout Chinese history. And the Han period saw the development and spread of several important innovations that increased the productivity of farming and allowed the population to grow to such impressive numbers, including improvements in the design of plows that incorporated iron plowshares, capable of turning the heavy soils of northern China more effectively than the wooden implements of earlier periods, and the development of the chain pump, a device consisting of a series of wooden pallets attached to an endless loop of chain that could be turned by human power or by animals, drawing water up from wells or irrigation channels and depositing it into fields at a higher elevation, making it possible to cultivate lands that would otherwise have remained too dry for the growing of grain. Perhaps equally important was the system of field management, sometimes called the alternating field system, in which farmers would cultivate their land in carefully planned rotations, leaving portions of their holdings fallow in alternate years so that the soil might recover its fertility, and planting their crops in furrows that would be reversed in subsequent years, so that what had been a ridge would become a furrow, and what had been a furrow would become a ridge, a practice that helped to distribute nutrients more evenly across the field and to prevent the exhaustion of the land that could result from continuous cultivation of the same plots in the same manner, year after year. And these agricultural techniques, combined with the relative peace and stability that the Han government was able to maintain across large portions of its territory for extended periods, allowed the farming families who formed the foundation of the empire to produce the surplus grain that supported the growing population of officials and artisans and merchants in the cities. Among the inventions that emerged from the Han period, few would prove more consequential for the development of human civilization than the creation of paper, which is traditionally attributed to a court official named Kai Lun in 105 of the Common Era, though archaeological evidence suggests that simpler forms of paper may have existed somewhat earlier. And Kai Lun's contribution was perhaps more in the nature of refining and standardizing the manufacturing process than in making an entirely original discovery. But regardless of the precise details of its origins, the paper that was produced during the Han Dynasty was made from a combination of materials, including the inner bark of the mulberry tree, hemp fibers, and old rags, which were soaked and pounded and mixed with water to form a slurry from which thin sheets could be formed on screens and then dried, creating a writing surface that was lighter and less expensive than the silk that had previously been used for many documents and more convenient than the bamboo strips that had served for centuries as the standard medium for written texts. And while it would take many centuries more for paper to spread beyond China, and eventually to transform the possibilities for communication and the preservation of knowledge throughout the world, its development during the Han period represents one of the most significant technological achievements of the ancient world. The intellectual life of the Han Dynasty was shaped not only by the official promotion of Confucian learning, but also by a flourishing of literary production that included both the preservation and editing of ancient texts and the creation of new works in various genres. And among the distinctive literary forms that developed during this period was the Fu, a kind of extended poetic composition characterized by elaborate descriptions, extensive use of parallel constructions, and a tendency toward encyclopedic cataloging of objects and phenomena, with Fu poems devoted to such subjects as capital cities, imperial hunts, and the grandeur of the court, composed in a style that was ornate and demanding, and that served to display the erudition and verbal facility of its practitioners, who were often officials at court, seeking to demonstrate their literary accomplishments alongside their administrative abilities. The greatest work of historical writing produced during the Han period, and indeed one of the foundational texts of Chinese historical literature, was the Shiji, or Records of the Grand Historian, composed by Sima Qian in the decades around the beginning of the 1st century before the Common Era, a comprehensive history covering more than 2,000 years, from the legendary Yellow Emperor down to the reign of Emperor Wu, during whose reign Sima Qian served as court historian. And this monumental work established models for historical writing that would be followed by Chinese historians for the next 2 millennia, including the organization of historical material into annals of emperors, chronological tables, treatises on particular subjects such as astronomy and economics, accounts of hereditary noble houses, and biographies of notable individuals, a structure that allowed for the presentation of the same events from multiple perspectives, and that gave particular attention to the lives and characters of individuals as a means of conveying moral and political lessons. The composition of this work was accomplished under circumstances of considerable personal difficulty. For Sima Qian had fallen into disfavor with Emperor Wu after defending a general who had surrendered to the enemy rather than dying in battle, and the punishment imposed upon him was castration, a mutilating sentence that would normally have been considered so shameful as to make continued life impossible. And yet Sima Qian chose to endure the disgrace in order to complete the historical work that he had inherited from his father, and that he believed to be of sufficient importance to justify the preservation of a life that might otherwise have been honorably ended. And in letters that survive from this period, he expressed his anguish at the humiliation he had suffered, while also articulating his determination to finish what he had begun. A decision that the subsequent centuries have vindicated, as the Shiji remains one of the most influential and widely read works in the Chinese literary tradition in the realm of science and technology. The Han period produced remarkable achievements, including the seismoscope created by Shang in 132 of the Common Era, a device that could detect the occurrence of earthquakes at considerable distances from the capital, reportedly indicating on one occasion the direction of an earthquake that had occurred some 500 kilometers away. And while the precise mechanism by which this instrument functioned has been debated by scholars, the contemporary accounts describe a large bronze vessel with 8 dragon heads arranged around its exterior, each holding a bronze ball in its mouth. And when an earthquake occurred, the vibrations would cause an internal mechanism to release the ball from the dragon head, corresponding to the direction from which the tremor had come, dropping it into the mouth of a bronze toad positioned beneath, providing an indication of where in the empire disaster had struck and where relief efforts might be needed. The extraordinary preservation of certain Han Dynasty tombs has provided modern archaeologists and historians with insights into daily life and material culture that written records alone could never have supplied. And among the most significant of these discoveries are the Huang tombs. Sealed in approximately 168 before the Common Era and excavated in the 1970s, which contained not only the remarkably preserved body of a noblewoman known as Lady Di, whose tissues remained sufficiently intact that her blood type could be identified as type A, and an autopsy could determine that she had suffered from coronary artery disease and gallstones, but also an extraordinary collection of objects intended to accompany her into the afterlife, including silk manuscripts of previously unknown texts and the oldest complete copy of the Tao Te Ching that has yet been discovered, along with painted silk banners depicting the journey of the soul and lacquerware containers still holding food that had been placed in the tomb more than 2,000 years before its opening. These discoveries from Huang and from other Han Dynasty sites reveal a civilization of considerable sophistication, where the wealthy could commission elaborate burial goods, and the educated could engage with philosophical and literary traditions of great complexity, while the vast majority of the population continued to work the land and to participate in the cycles of planting and harvest that sustained the empire. And as the generations passed and emperors succeeded one another on the throne, the administrative structures and cultural patterns established during the Han would become so deeply embedded in Chinese civilization that even after the dynasty finally collapsed in the early 3rd century of the Common Era, the memory of Han greatness would remain a touchstone for all subsequent attempts to reunify and govern the empire. And to this day, the majority ethnic group in China identifies itself as Han Chinese, a testament to the enduring legacy of those 4 centuries of development and achievement that began with a rebel leader from a small town and grew into one of the greatest empires the ancient world would ever know. And now we come to a time in Chinese history that has captured more imaginations than perhaps any other, a period of roughly 100 years that would become the subject of endless storytelling, theatrical performance, and artistic representation across the centuries that followed. This era, known as the Three Kingdoms, occupies a peculiar space in the collective memory, sitting somewhere between history and legend, between the dusty records of court annals and the vivid colors of popular romance. It is a time worth examining slowly, gently separating what we can reasonably know from what later generations wish to believe, understanding that both the facts and the fictions reveal something important about how people make meaning from the chaos of their past. The transformation of this historical period into legendary material reached its fullest expression in the 14th century, when a writer named Liu Guanzhong compiled and refined centuries of accumulated storytelling into a sprawling novel that would become one of the most influential works of Chinese literature. This novel, known in English as The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, drew upon historical chronicles, theatrical traditions, and oral storytelling to create a narrative of heroism, loyalty, cunning, and tragedy that would shape how countless readers understood this tumultuous century. Yet the actual events, as recorded by contemporary and near-contemporary historians, present us with a more complicated picture, one that is in many ways more interesting precisely because it lacks the moral clarity of romance. The real figures who moved through this period were neither heroes nor villains in any simple sense, but rather complex individuals responding to circumstances of extraordinary difficulty, making choices that sometimes seem admirable and sometimes seem brutal, often within the space of a single campaign or a single year. The troubles that would eventually fracture the Han Dynasty into 3 competing states began to manifest clearly in the year 184 of the Common Era, when a religious movement that had been quietly spreading through the eastern regions of the empire suddenly erupted into open rebellion. This movement was led by a man named Zhang, who had developed a form of Taoist millenarian teaching that promised both spiritual salvation and physical healing to its followers. Zhang taught that the Han Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, that the era of the blue heaven was ending, and that a new age of the yellow heaven was about to dawn. His followers wore yellow cloth wrapped around their heads as a sign of their allegiance to this coming transformation, which is why later historians would call this uprising the Yellow Turban Rebellion, though the participants themselves likely thought of their movement in rather different terms. The organizational structure that Zhang created was remarkably sophisticated, dividing his followers into 36 regional congregations, each led by a general who combined military and religious authority. Contemporary sources claim that his movement attracted approximately 360,000 committed followers, though such figures in ancient sources should always be treated with some caution, representing perhaps more the impression of overwhelming numbers than a precise census. What made the Yellow Turban movement so dangerous to the established order was not merely its size, but its ideological character. For this was not simply a peasant uprising motivated by economic grievance, though such grievances certainly played their part, but rather a challenge to the fundamental legitimacy of imperial rule. Zhang and his brothers proclaimed that the Han had exhausted its cosmic mandate, that sickness and suffering were signs of heaven's displeasure, and that only through joining the movement and practicing its rituals could ordinary people hope to survive the coming transition between ages. This millenarian urgency gave the rebellion a momentum that purely material motivations might not have provided, driving followers to acts of considerable courage and considerable violence in roughly equal measure. The imperial court, weakened by decades of factional conflict and economic strain, found itself forced to rely upon regional strongmen and local military commanders to suppress the uprising, a decision that would have consequences far beyond the immediate crisis. For in delegating military authority to these provincial figures, the central government was essentially creating the very warlords who would eventually tear the empire apart. Among the minor officials who rose to prominence during these years of crisis was a man named Cao, whose career trajectory would take him from the relatively modest position of a local police captain to become the most powerful figure in northern China, founder of a dynasty in all but name. Cao's grandfather had been a palace eunuch, a connection that gave the family both wealth and political access, while also marking them with a certain social stigma. For eunuchs were often viewed with suspicion and contempt by the Confucian scholarly class. This background perhaps contributed to the complexity of Cao's character. His mixture of refined cultural attainment and ruthless political calculation, his ability to patronize poets and philosophers while simultaneously ordering the execution of anyone who threatened his power. What distinguishes our understanding of Cao from many other historical figures of this period is that his own literary work survives, a collection of poetry that reveals a mind given to philosophical reflection, melancholy contemplation of mortality, and genuine artistic ambition. In one of his most famous poems, he describes the short span of human life against the enduring presence of the natural world, comparing human ambition to the morning dew that vanishes with the rising sun, and yet affirming his determination to accomplish great things despite this awareness of impermanence. These are not the verses of a simple villain, and indeed the historical Cao seems to have been something rather more interesting than either hero or villain, a man of genuine talent and genuine cruelty, capable of both magnanimity and massacre, depending upon his calculation of strategic advantage. the event that would fix the basic configuration of the Three Kingdoms period, establishing the division of China into three competing realms, was a naval engagement fought in the winter of 208 of the Common Era, known to later generations as the Battle of Red Cliffs. Cao had by this point consolidated control over the northern heartland of China, subduing or absorbing the various warlords who had carved out territories in the decades of disorder. And he now turned his attention southward, seeking to complete the reunification of the empire under his own authority. The precise size of his forces remains a matter of scholarly debate, with contemporary sources suggesting numbers ranging from 220,000 to considerably smaller figures. Though whatever the actual total, it is clear that Cao commanded a significantly larger army than his opponents. Against this northern juggernaut stood an unlikely alliance between the state of Wu, controlling the rich lands south of the Yangtze River under the leadership of the young Sun Quan, and the wandering warlord Liu Bei, who at this point possessed little territory of his own, but commanded the loyalty of a capable band of followers. The alliance was brokered in large part through the diplomatic efforts of Liu Bei's advisor Zhuge Liang, whose historical achievements, while impressive, have become so encrusted with legend that separating fact from fiction requires considerable care. The battle itself appears to have been decided primarily by fire, with the southern allies using ships loaded with combustible materials to ignite the closely packed northern fleet, which had been chained together to provide stability for soldiers unaccustomed to naval warfare. The conflagration spread rapidly through Cao's vessels, and the destruction of his fleet forced a general retreat that ended any immediate prospect of northern conquest. Yet even basic facts about this famous engagement remain contested among modern historians, including the precise location where it took place, with various sites along the Yangtze River claiming the honor of being the true Red Cliffs. What is not disputed is the strategic consequence of the battle, which established a rough equilibrium among three powers that would persist for the better part of a century, with Cao and his successors controlling the north as the state of Wei, Sun Quan and his family ruling the southeast as the state of Wu, and Liu Bei eventually carving out a domain in the southwest as the state of Shu. Zhuge Liang, who would become perhaps the most romanticized figure of this entire period, served Liu Bei and later his son as chief advisor and effective administrator of the Shu state. The novel portrays him as an almost supernatural genius, capable of controlling the weather, predicting the future, and outwitting all opponents through sheer intellectual brilliance. But the historical record, while still depicting an impressive figure, presents someone rather more human. His genuine innovations appear to have included improvements to crossbow design that increased both range and rate of fire, though the precise nature of these improvements is difficult to reconstruct from surviving descriptions. He is also credited with developing a transportation device called the wooden ox or flowing horse, apparently some form of wheelbarrow or cart designed to move supplies efficiently through the mountainous terrain that characterized much of Shu territory. Perhaps more importantly, his administration of Shu was marked by efficient governance, fair taxation, and the maintenance of internal stability, despite the constant military pressure from the larger and more populous Wei state to the north. He conducted a series of northern campaigns attempting to restore Han rule, none of which succeeded in their ultimate objective, but all of which demonstrated considerable strategic skill. And he died in 234 during the fifth of these expeditions, worn out by years of ceaseless labor on behalf of a cause that was perhaps already hopeless. The figure of Liu Bei himself presents an interesting case study in the divergence between historical record and literary representation. The novel presents him as an embodiment of benevolence and legitimate authority, the rightful heir to the Han imperial line, who wishes only to restore good government and relieve the suffering of the common people. The historical Liu Bei appears to have been rather more complicated. A skilled political operator who changed allegiances multiple times during his early career, attaching himself to whichever patron seemed most likely to advance his interests at any given moment. His treatment of certain subordinates and rivals suggests a capacity for ruthlessness that the novel tends to elide or excuse, though it should be said that ruthlessness was hardly unusual in a period when political failure typically meant death. What is perhaps most accurate in the literary tradition is Liu Bei's remarkable ability to inspire loyalty among his followers, for the men who attached themselves to his cause tended to remain devoted even when circumstances turned against him, suggesting some genuine quality of personal magnetism that transcended mere calculation. Among those devoted followers was Guan Yu, a warrior whose posthumous reputation would far exceed his historical achievements, eventually resulting in his elevation to divine status in Chinese popular religion. The historical Guan Yu was certainly an impressive military figure, commanding Liu Bei's forces in several significant engagements and holding the strategically vital city of Jingzhou against Wei and Wu alike. His death in 219, captured and executed after a failed campaign against Wei, was a significant blow to Shu's military position and to Liu Bei personally. Yet there is little in the contemporary sources to suggest that he was regarded as anything more than an exceptionally capable general during his lifetime. His transformation into a god began gradually during the Sui dynasty, several centuries after his death, when he began to be venerated as a protective spirit, and continued through subsequent dynasties until he became one of the most widely worshipped deities in Chinese folk religion, the patron of soldiers, martial artists, and even accountants, his red face and long beard becoming one of the most recognizable images in Chinese visual culture. The Three Kingdoms period came to an end not through the triumph of any of its original founding families, but through the rise of the Sima clan, who had served the Wei state as generals and administrators for decades before finally seizing power for themselves. In 265, Sima Yan compelled the last Wei emperor to abdicate, establishing the Jin dynasty and setting about the completion of unification. Wu fell in 280, and for a brief moment, China was once again united under a single government. Yet this unity would prove fragile, and the Jin dynasty would itself collapse into civil war and foreign invasion within a few decades, ushering in centuries of division that would not be fully overcome until the Sui reunification in 589. Perhaps the most sobering reality of the Three Kingdoms period, one that the Romantic tradition tends to pass over in its focus on heroic individuals and dramatic battles, is the sheer scale of human suffering that accompanied these decades of warfare. Census records from before and after the period suggest that China's population fell from approximately 56 million to somewhere under 16 million, a decline of roughly 70%. That represents one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in recorded history. Some portion of this apparent decline may reflect the inability of successor states to conduct accurate censuses of populations living outside their effective control, and some people surely fled to remote areas where they escaped official counting. But even accounting for these factors, the mortality caused by war, famine, disease, and displacement must have been staggering. Behind every clever stratagem celebrated in the novel, behind every heroic last stand and tragic betrayal, lay countless ordinary people whose names no history records, whose sufferings no poetry commemorates, but whose absence from the population registers speaks to a reality that no amount of romantic retelling can entirely obscure. It is worth sitting with that knowledge for a moment, allowing it to temper our appreciation of the era's undeniable dramatic power with an awareness of its equally undeniable human cost, before we let ourselves drift onward to whatever thoughts come next. The story of how Buddhism came to China is not a story of sudden conversion or dramatic revelation, but rather a gentle process of gradual arrival, quiet adaptation, and slow transformation that unfolded across many centuries. And if you were to trace its path on a map, you would see it following the ancient trade routes that connected the civilizations of Asia, moving eastward along the Silk Road through oasis towns and mountain passes, carried by merchants and monks and travelers who brought not only goods but also ideas. And in this way, a faith that had been born in the Indian subcontinent some 500 years before the Common Era began its long journey toward the Middle Kingdom, where it would eventually take root and flourish in ways that its original teachers could never have anticipated. The traditional account of Buddhism's formal introduction to China centers on the White Horse Temple, which was established in the year 68 of the Common Era in the city of Luoyang, during the reign of Emperor Ming of the Han Dynasty. And this temple, which still stands today as one of the oldest Buddhist sites in China, takes its name from the white horses that are said to have carried the first Buddhist scriptures into the imperial capital. And while this founding date has become the conventional marker for Buddhism's arrival, the reality is almost certainly more complex. For there is evidence to suggest that Buddhist ideas, and perhaps even Buddhist communities, had already made their way into Chinese territory through the steady flow of trade along the Silk Road, filtering in through the western regions where merchants from Central Asia and India conducted their business. And so the establishment of the White Horse Temple might be better understood not as the first moment of contact, but as the first official recognition, the point at which Buddhism became visible to the imperial court and began its long process of integration into Chinese religious and cultural life. The legend surrounding Emperor Ming's invitation to the Indian monks who would found this temple is a lovely one, and it speaks to the way that important historical developments are often remembered through the lens of personal stories and divine signs. And according to this account, the emperor had a dream in which he saw a golden deity flying before his palace, a radiant figure that seemed to come from the west. And upon waking, he asked his ministers what this vision might mean, and one of them suggested that this must be the Buddha, a sage from India, whose teachings spoke of enlightenment and the end of suffering. And so moved was the emperor by this dream that he dispatched envoys to travel westward in search of this teaching. And they returned some years later with 2 Indian monks named Kashyapa Matanga and Dharmaratna, along with scriptures and images carried on white horses. And though we cannot know whether this dream truly occurred, or whether the story grew up later to explain the temple's founding, it captures something true about the way Buddhism was received in China, as a teaching that seemed to address deep questions about existence and suffering, questions that the native traditions of Confucianism and Taoism approached in rather different ways. One of the most fascinating and challenging aspects of Buddhism's early history in China was the problem of translation. For the monks who wished to share the Buddha's teachings faced the considerable difficulty of rendering concepts that had developed within an Indian cultural and philosophical context into a language and worldview that had evolved quite separately. And words like nirvana, which refers to the ultimate release from the cycle of rebirth and suffering, and dharma, which encompasses both the Buddha's teaching and the fundamental nature of reality, had no obvious equivalents in Chinese. And so the early translators developed an approach that scholars call the Gei method, which involved matching Buddhist concepts with terms that already existed within the Chinese philosophical vocabulary, particularly within Taoism. And so, nirvana might be explained through the Taoist concept of wu-wei, or non-action, and dharma might be rendered using the word Tao, the way. And while this method made Buddhist ideas more accessible to Chinese readers, it also inevitably altered their meaning, blending them with associations and connotations that had not been present in the original Indian context. And in this way, Buddhism began to take on a distinctly Chinese character, almost from the moment of its arrival, adapting itself to the intellectual landscape it encountered. The limitations of the Gyi method became increasingly apparent as Chinese understanding of Buddhism deepened. And by the 4th and 5th centuries, a new generation of translators emerged who were committed to more precise and faithful renderings of the original texts. And among these translators, none was more significant than the figure of Kumarajiva, a monk of mixed Indian and Kukian heritage who arrived in the Chinese capital of Chang'an in the year 401 and proceeded to lead one of the most remarkable translation projects in the history of world literature, gathering around him a team of scholars who worked systematically through the major Buddhist scriptures, producing translations that were not only more accurate than their predecessors, but also more beautiful, rendered in a Chinese that was clear and elegant and accessible. And his versions of texts like the Lotus Sutra and the Heart Sutra became the standard editions that Chinese Buddhists would study for centuries to come. And there is a curious story told about Kumarajiva that suggests something of the unusual position he occupied. For it is said that the emperor, wishing to ensure that Kumarajiva's extraordinary intellectual gifts might be passed on to future generations, ordered him to take wives and father children, which was of course contrary to the monastic vows that Buddhist monks were expected to maintain, and whether this actually occurred or was merely a later legend. It speaks to the way that Chinese rulers often sought to bend Buddhism to their own purposes, valuing it as a source of cultural prestige and intellectual achievement, while not always respecting the disciplines and practices that lay at its heart. The desire for authentic scriptures and a deeper understanding of Buddhism led some Chinese monks to undertake the dangerous journey to India itself, traveling thousands of miles across deserts and mountains to reach the land where the Buddha had lived and taught. And among these pilgrims, the monk Faxian holds a special place, for his journey, which began in the year 399 and lasted until 412, was one of the first well-documented Chinese pilgrimages to India, and remains a valuable source of information about the Buddhist world in that era. And if you were to imagine the hardships he faced, you might begin with the crossing of the Taklamakan Desert, whose name in the local language is sometimes said to mean something like the place you go in, but do not come out of. A vast expanse of shifting sand, where travelers navigated by the bones of those who had perished before them. And Faxian described how there were neither birds above nor animals below, and no water or grass to be seen, and how he and his companions looked in all directions for a path to cross, but could find none, the only markers being the dried bones of the dead. And yet he pressed on, driven by his determination to obtain authentic Buddhist texts. And after years of travel through Central Asia and India, visiting the sacred sites associated with the Buddha's life, he returned to China, not by the overland route, but by sea, sailing from Sri Lanka across the Indian Ocean and eventually reaching the Chinese coast. And he brought with him a collection of Sanskrit manuscripts that he spent his remaining years translating, adding to the growing body of Buddhist literature available to Chinese readers. The physical monuments of Buddhism's transformation of China are perhaps nowhere more impressive than in the Magao caves at Dunhuang, which sit at the edge of the Gobi Desert along the ancient Silk Road. And the founding of these caves is attributed to a monk named Yu Zun, who in the year 366 is said to have been traveling through this region when he saw a vision of 1,000 golden Buddhas shimmering on the cliff face before him. And inspired by this vision, he began to carve the first cave shrine into the rock. And over the following centuries, generation after generation of Buddhist devotees would continue this work, excavating hundreds of caves and adorning them with paintings and sculptures that depicted the Buddha and his teachings, the figures of bodhisattvas and celestial beings, scenes from the scriptures and from the lives of monks and donors. And if you were to walk through these caves today, you would find yourself surrounded by images that span nearly 1,000 years of Buddhist art, created by artists who worked by lamplight in the darkness of the caves, mixing their pigments from minerals and plants, covering the walls and ceilings with colors that have survived the centuries. And the Mogao Caves became not only a site of worship, but also a repository of Buddhist learning, a place where manuscripts were copied and stored, including the famous library cave that was sealed up around the year 1000 and rediscovered 9 centuries later, containing tens of thousands of documents that have transformed our understanding of medieval Central Asia and the religious life of the Silk Road. Buddhism's journey in China was not always peaceful or welcomed, for there were periods when rulers turned against the foreign faith and sought to reduce its influence. And among these persecutions, one of the most severe occurred under Emperor Taiwu of the Northern Wei Dynasty in the year 446, when the emperor, influenced by Taoist advisors who resented Buddhism's growing popularity, and perhaps also concerned about the economic and social power that Buddhist monasteries had accumulated, issued a decree ordering the destruction of temples and the return of monks and nuns to ordinary life, and images of the Buddha were smashed, scriptures were burned, and those who resisted faced severe punishment. And for a time, it seemed as though Buddhism might be driven from the Northern Wei entirely. But the persecution proved relatively short-lived, lasting only a few years before the emperor's death brought a change in policy, and Buddhism recovered and indeed flourished under subsequent rulers. And this pattern would repeat itself at various points in Chinese history, with periodic efforts to suppress the faith, followed by revivals and renewals, demonstrating both the vulnerability of Buddhism as a foreign import and its remarkable resilience and ability to adapt and survive. As the centuries passed, Buddhism developed along distinctive lines within China, giving rise to schools and traditions that, while rooted in Indian origins, took on forms that were uniquely suited to the Chinese religious sensibility. And among these, 2 deserve particular mention for their lasting influence. The first being the Pure Land School, which centered on devotion to the Buddha Amitabha and the aspiration to be reborn in his Western paradise, a beautiful realm free from suffering, where conditions were ideal for achieving enlightenment. And this tradition taught that by sincerely reciting the name of Amitabha Buddha, even ordinary people burdened by the difficulties of everyday life could ensure their rebirth in this pure land. And this message of hope and accessibility appealed to countless Chinese Buddhists who found the demanding practices of other schools beyond their reach. And the Pure Land tradition remains one of the most widely practiced forms of Buddhism in East Asia to this day. The other distinctively Chinese school that emerged during this period was Chan, which would later become known as Zen when it was transmitted to Japan. And this tradition emphasized meditation and direct insight over the study of scriptures, teaching that enlightenment was not something to be gained through learning or ritual, but was rather an immediate recognition of one's own original nature, already present and complete, requiring only that the obscurations of ordinary thinking be cleared away. And Chan teachers developed a variety of methods to provoke this recognition in their students, including the use of paradoxical statements and questions that could not be answered through logical reasoning, designed to short-circuit the discursive mind and open the door to a more direct way of knowing. And this tradition would become one of the most influential forms of Buddhism in East Asian history, shaping not only religious practice, but also art and literature, and the cultivation of everyday life. And so Buddhism, which had begun its journey to China as a foreign faith, carried along dusty trade routes by merchants and missionaries, gradually became woven into the fabric of Chinese civilization, transformed by its encounter with Chinese thought and culture, even as it transformed them in return. And the temples and caves and translations and schools that emerged from this encounter stand as testimony to one of the most significant cultural exchanges in human history. A meeting of civilizations that unfolded not through conquest or coercion, but through the patient work of translation, the dedication of pilgrims, the devotion of artists, and the quiet persistence of those who believed that the Buddha's teachings had something of value to offer. And perhaps this is enough to know for now, as the story of Buddhism in China continues through later centuries, with further developments and transformations still to come. But that is a matter for another time. And for now, you may let these images settle gently in your mind. The white horses arriving at Huang, the golden Buddhas shimmering on the cliff face at Dunhuang, the pilgrims making their way across the desert toward India, the translators working by candlelight to render ancient wisdom into new words, all of it unfolding slowly across the centuries, like a river finding its way through a landscape, patient and unhurried, carrying its waters toward the sea. And so we come now to one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in all of human history, a waterway that stretches across the heartland of China, like a long and patient thread, connecting the warm and fertile lands of the south to the cooler, drier regions of the north. This is the Grand Canal, and its story is one of vision and ambition, of tremendous labor and tremendous cost, and of an emperor whose name would become forever intertwined with both the magnificence and the tragedy of its creation. Let us settle into this tale, as one might settle into a comfortable chair beside a window overlooking water, for it is a story that moves at the pace of a barge drifting along a calm and ancient channel, and there is no need to hurry through it at all. The emperor in question was Huang, known to history as Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty, and he ruled from the year 604 until 618 of the Common Era. He was the second emperor of the Sui, following his father Emperor Wen, who had accomplished the remarkable feat of reunifying China after nearly 4 centuries of division and fragmentation. The Sui dynasty itself was brief, lasting only 37 years, from 581 to 618. And yet within that short span of time, it managed to reshape the landscape of China in ways that would endure for more than 1,000 years. Emperor Yang inherited a unified realm and a treasury that was, for the moment, reasonably full, and he set about using both with an ambition that bordered on the obsessive, pouring resources into projects of such scale that they would ultimately exhaust the patience and the bodies of his subjects. The Grand Canal was not created from nothing, for the Chinese had been building canals for centuries before Emperor Yang was born. One of the earliest and most significant of these was the Hanggu Canal, constructed in 486 before the Common Era by King Fushai of the state of Wu. King Fushai had his own strategic reasons for building waterways, wishing to move troops and supplies northward in his campaigns against rival states, and the Hanggu Canal served as a vital link in the water transport network of its time. Other rulers in other eras had dug their own channels and improved upon existing ones, so that by the time of the Sui dynasty, there existed a patchwork of waterways scattered across the landscape, some well-maintained and others fallen into disrepair, none of them forming a continuous and navigable route from one end of the empire to the other. What Emperor Yang envisioned was something far more comprehensive, a system of interconnected canals that would link the Yangtze River in the south to the Yellow River in the north, and eventually extend all the way to the region around modern Beijing. The total length of this system would eventually reach approximately 1,776 kilometers, making it one of the longest artificial waterways ever constructed anywhere in the world. The practical genius of this undertaking lay in its recognition of a fundamental geographic reality, which was that the fertile rice-growing regions of the Yangtze River Basin could produce far more grain than the northern regions where the political and military capitals were located. By creating a reliable water route between these two areas, the Grand Canal would make it possible to transport vast quantities of rice and other goods from south to north, feeding the armies and the bureaucracies and the populations of the northern cities without the enormous expense and difficulty of overland transport. To accomplish this vision, Emperor Yang ordered the conscription of laborers on a scale that is difficult for the modern mind to fully comprehend. Historical sources, though they must be treated with some caution given the tendency of later dynasties to exaggerate the failings of their predecessors, suggest that as many as 5.5 million workers were pressed into service on the canal project. These were not volunteers seeking employment, but ordinary farmers and townspeople who were compelled by imperial decree to leave their homes and their fields and their families, traveling sometimes great distances to dig and dredge and haul earth under the supervision of government overseers. The work was grueling beyond description, performed with hand tools and woven baskets in all seasons and all weather, and the death toll among these laborers was staggering. Workers died from exhaustion and from exposure, from accidents and from disease, and they died in such numbers that the project threatened to consume the very population that was meant to complete it. When villages found themselves unable to provide enough men to meet their quotas, the authorities reportedly resorted to conscripting women as well. And when workers perished faster than they could be replaced, entire families were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands to areas along the canal route, pressed into continuing the labor that had already claimed so many lives. The human cost of the Grand Canal is impossible to calculate with any precision, but it was immense. And the memory of that suffering would contribute to the resentment and rebellion that would eventually bring down the Sui dynasty itself. And yet, even as the common people bent their backs and broke their bodies in the muddy trenches of the canal works, Emperor Yang indulged in displays of imperial grandeur that seemed almost deliberately provocative in their extravagance. When the southern sections of the canal were completed enough to be navigable, the emperor organized imperial processions along the waterway that were designed to demonstrate the power and the majesty of the Sui. The centerpiece of these processions was the emperor's own dragon boat, a floating palace of almost unbelievable scale. According to contemporary accounts, this vessel rose 4 decks high above the water and contained within its structure some 80 rooms, including throne halls and receiving chambers and private apartments for the emperor and his consorts. The dragon boat was not propelled by sails or by oarsmen in the conventional sense, but was instead pulled along the canal by teams of trackers walking along the banks. And the number of these trackers required to move the imperial barge is recorded as having been approximately 80,000 men. The imperial procession stretched for miles along the canal, with the emperor's dragon boat followed by hundreds or perhaps thousands of smaller vessels, carrying officials and courtiers and servants and supplies, all of it gliding along the waterway that had been built at such terrible cost. The spectacle was magnificent. There is no denying that, and it served its intended purpose of projecting imperial authority and demonstrating the reach and the capability of the Sui state. But to the exhausted laborers who had dug the canal with their own hands, and to the families who had lost fathers and sons and brothers to the project, the sight of such luxury must have seemed like a bitter mockery of their sacrifice. Along the banks of the canal, Emperor Yang ordered the planting of willow trees. Their graceful branches meant to provide shade for the trackers who pulled the barges, and for the travelers who would pass along this route for generations to come. These willows took root and flourished, their long and slender branches drooping toward the water in that characteristic weeping posture that makes willows such melancholy and beautiful trees. In Chinese, these trees came to be called yang willows, written with characters that can be rendered as Chuiyonglu, and this name has persisted through the centuries to the present day, so that even now, when one walks along the banks of the Grand Canal in certain stretches, one walks beneath trees that bear the name of the emperor, who ordered them planted more than 1400 years ago. It is a strange sort of immortality, to have one's name preserved, not in monuments of stone or bronze, but in the common name of a tree, and yet perhaps it is fitting, for the willows have outlasted the palaces and the dragon boats, and nearly all the other material traces of Emperor Yang's reign. The Grand Canal was not the only great project that consumed Emperor Yang's attention and his empire's resources. He was also determined to bring the Korean kingdoms under Chinese control, and to this end he launched a series of military campaigns against the state of Goguryeo, which occupied much of the Korean peninsula and parts of what is now northeastern China. The first of these campaigns began in the year 612, and it was conducted on a scale commensurate with the emperor's other undertakings, with armies reportedly numbering over 1 million men marching northward toward the Goguryeo frontier. The campaign was a disaster almost from the beginning, hampered by logistical difficulties and by the fierce resistance of the Goguryeo defenders. And when the Chinese forces attempted to advance on the Goguryeo capital, they were ambushed and annihilated in a battle near the Salsu River, with losses that may have reached 300,000 men in a single engagement. Emperor Yang was not deterred by this catastrophe, and he launched additional campaigns in 613 and 614, each of which ended in failure and further loss of life. The Korean campaigns drained the treasury that the Canal project had already severely depleted, and they drew away the farmers and the laborers who might otherwise have been cultivating the fields and producing the food that the empire needed to sustain itself. Rebellion began to break out in various parts of the realm, as desperate and overtaxed subjects concluded that they had nothing left to lose by rising up against imperial authority. Emperor Yang retreated southward to the city of Jiangdu, where he spent his final years in something like denial, surrounding himself with entertainments and refusing to confront the disintegration of his empire. In 618, he was strangled by his own guards in a palace coup, and the Sui dynasty came to an end after less than 4 decades of existence. It would be left to the Tang dynasty, which emerged from the chaos of the Sui collapse, to consolidate and build upon the achievements that the Sui had begun. The Grand Canal continued to serve as the vital artery connecting north and south, and it would remain in use and be expanded and improved upon for more than 1,000 years. The legal code that the Sui had compiled became the foundation for the Tang Code, which would influence legal systems throughout East Asia. The examination system for selecting government officials, which the Sui had refined and expanded, would become one of the defining institutions of Chinese civilization, shaping the intellectual and social life of the empire for centuries. The reunification that Emperor Wen had achieved and that Emperor Yang had squandered would be restored and sustained by the Tang, ushering in what many historians consider the greatest golden age in Chinese history. The Sui dynasty, brief and troubled as it was, thus occupies a peculiar position in the long sweep of Chinese history. It was a dynasty of tremendous accomplishment and tremendous failure, a vision that outstripped the resources available to realize it, of emperors who dreamed on a scale that their subjects could not sustain. The Grand Canal remains as the most tangible and enduring legacy of this era, a waterway that still carries traffic today, though the barges that travel it are rather different from the dragon boats of Emperor Yang. The willows still line portions of its banks, their branches trailing toward the water as they have done for 14 centuries, indifferent to the dynasties that have risen and fallen along its shores. And so we leave the Grand Canal now, gliding gently away from its story as a barge might drift with the current on a quiet evening. When the light is fading and the willows cast long shadows across the water, the canal will still be there tomorrow, as it has been there for all these many years, patient and useful and beautiful in its way, carrying the memory of those millions of anonymous laborers whose names were never recorded, but whose work has endured. We might think of them, if we like, as we settle deeper into rest, those countless ordinary people who moved the earth with their hands and made possible one of the wonders of the ancient world, and we might let their long-ago efforts lull us gently towards sleep, as the slow movement of water has always lulled those who travel upon it or rest beside it on a peaceful night. And so we come now to one of the most remarkable figures in all of Chinese history, a woman whose life spanned nearly the entire 7th century, and whose reign would challenge every assumption about who might hold power in imperial China. Wu Zetian, as she would come to be known, remains the only woman in more than 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history to rule, not as regent, not as dowager empress wielding power behind a screen, but as emperor in her own right, with her own dynasty name, her own era titles, and her own place in the formal succession of Chinese sovereigns. Her story begins, as so many stories of the Tang palace began, with a young girl entering the vast complex of buildings and courtyards that housed the emperor and his enormous household. Though no one at that time could possibly have imagined where this particular girl's path would eventually lead. She was born around the year 624 CE, during the very first years of the Tang dynasty, to a family of modest but respectable standing. Her father had been a successful timber merchant who had the good fortune and good judgment to support Li Yuan, the founder of the Tang, during his rise to power. This early loyalty was rewarded with official positions and noble titles, elevating the family into the ranks of the lesser aristocracy, though they remained far beneath the great families who traced their lineages back through centuries of imperial service. The young girl who would become Wu Zetian received an unusually thorough education for a woman of her time, learning to read and write with considerable skill, studying history and literature, and developing an understanding of politics and governance that would serve her throughout her extraordinary life. In the year 637 CE, when she was approximately 14 years old, she was selected to enter the palace of Emperor Taizong as a concubine of the 5th rank, a relatively low position in the elaborate hierarchy of imperial consorts, but a position nonetheless that placed her within the innermost circles of Tang power. Emperor Taizong, the second Tang ruler and one of the most celebrated emperors in Chinese history, maintained a substantial household of wives, consorts, and palace women, and a 5th-rank concubine would have been merely one face among many hundreds. The historical records from this period are incomplete and often contradictory, written and rewritten by later historians with their own purposes and biases, so we cannot know with certainty how Wu Zetian spent her years in Taizong's palace. What we do know is that she did not advance significantly in rank during his lifetime, remaining a relatively minor figure in the imperial household throughout the roughly dozen years she spent there. When Emperor Taizong died in the year 649 CE, the young woman who had entered his palace as a girl of 14 was now a woman of approximately 26, and according to Tang custom, she faced the prospect of being sent to a Buddhist convent to spend the remainder of her days in prayer and seclusion, as was expected of imperial concubines upon the death of their sovereign. But something quite different occurred instead, something that would set in motion one of the most improbable rises to power in imperial history. Taizong's son, the new emperor Gaozong, had apparently formed an attachment to his father's former concubine. Whether before or after Taizong's death remains a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that Zetian did not remain in the convent permanently. By 651 CE, she had returned to the palace, now as a consort of Emperor Gaozong, a transition that was technically improper given her previous relationship with his father, but which proceeded nonetheless. Within the palace, she quickly demonstrated the political intelligence and determination that would characterize her entire career, rising through the ranks of imperial consorts with remarkable speed and beginning to accumulate real influence over the emperor himself. The path to supreme power required her to displace the existing Empress Huang, who had initially supported Zetian's return to the palace in hopes that she would distract the emperor from another favored consort. This calculation proved badly mistaken. By 654 CE, Zetian had given birth to several children and had become the emperor's clear favorite. Then, in 655 CE, her infant daughter died under circumstances that remain deeply unclear and deeply contested even today. According to some historical accounts, written primarily by Zetian's political enemies or their intellectual descendants, she killed the child herself and arranged the scene so that suspicion would fall upon Empress Huang, who had visited the infant's chambers shortly before the death was discovered. Other historians, both ancient and modern, have questioned this narrative, pointing out that it appears in sources written after Zetian's death by authors who had every reason to portray her in the worst possible light, and noting that the deaths of infants were tragically common in this era, even without any malicious intervention. What is not in dispute is the outcome of this episode. Empress Huang was accused of murdering the infant and was deposed from her position. Zetian was elevated to the rank of empress in her place. Despite significant opposition from many senior ministers and members of the old aristocratic families, who viewed her rise with alarm and her origins with contempt. Emperor Gaozong, however, was devoted to his new empress and supported her against her critics with unwavering determination. As the years passed and the emperor's health began to decline, suffering from what appears to have been a series of strokes that left him partially incapacitated, Empress Wu gradually took on more and more of the responsibilities of governance. By the 660s CE, she was issuing edicts alongside the emperor, participating openly in the conduct of state affairs, and building networks of loyal officials throughout the imperial bureaucracy. Her methods for maintaining control were innovative and, to her enemies, terrifying. She established a system of copper reporting boxes placed throughout the empire, into which anyone, regardless of rank or position, could deposit accusations against officials or other subjects. This network of informants and secret reports allowed her to identify and eliminate potential opponents before they could organize effective resistance, and it created an atmosphere of surveillance that kept even the most powerful families constantly aware that their actions might be observed and reported. The officials who managed this system came to function as a kind of secret police, investigating allegations, conducting interrogations, and recommending punishments. Many of these punishments were severe, and Zetian's reign would be marked by periodic purges of officials and aristocrats who fell under suspicion of disloyalty or conspiracy. Emperor Gaozong died in the year 683 CE, and for the next several years, Zetian ruled as Dowager Empress, placing first one son and then another on the throne, while retaining actual power for herself. Neither of these emperors, her sons Zhongzong and Ruzong, was permitted to rule in any meaningful sense, and both were eventually set aside when they proved insufficiently compliant with their mother's wishes. Then, in the year 690 CE, at approximately 67 years of age, Wu Zetian took a step that no woman in Chinese history had ever taken before or would ever take again. She formally ascended the throne as emperor, not as regent or dowager, but as sovereign ruler in her own right, and she proclaimed a new dynasty to replace the Tang, the Zhou dynasty, named after the ancient royal house that had ruled China nearly 2,000 years before. She even created a new character for her personal name, a character that had never existed before in the Chinese language. This character, pronounced Zhao and written Jia, combined the elements for sun and moon, positioned above the element for sky, creating a visual representation of celestial bodies, illuminating the heavens, a symbol of her own radiant authority shining down upon the empire. This act of linguistic creation was characteristic of her reign, which sought to reshape not only political institutions, but the very symbols and concepts through which power was understood and expressed. Her religious policies marked a significant departure from the Confucian orthodoxy that had traditionally supported imperial authority in China. Wu Zetian became a devoted patron of Buddhism, channeling enormous resources into the construction of temples, the commissioning of sculptures, and the support of monastic institutions. The massive Buddha statues carved into the cliffs at the Longmen Grottos near the eastern capital of Luoyang stand as the most visible monuments to this patronage. The largest of these figures, a seated Buddha of tremendous size and serene expression, was carved during her reign and has been suggested by some scholars to bear features modeled on the Empress herself. Though this claim remains debated, what is certain is that Wu Zetian promoted Buddhist ideas and institutions as sources of legitimacy that did not carry the patriarchal assumptions embedded in Confucian thought. Since Buddhism, unlike Confucianism, did not inherently exclude women from positions of spiritual authority. Her reforms extended to the civil service examination system as well, with consequences that would shape Chinese society for centuries to come. While the examination system had existed before her reign, Wu Zetian expanded it significantly, opening paths to official position for men from families of lower status, who might previously have found the highest ranks close to them, regardless of their abilities. This reform had the practical effect of creating a body of officials who owed their positions to the examination system rather than to aristocratic connections. Officials who therefore had reason to support the emperor who had made their advancement possible. The examination-based bureaucracy would become one of the defining features of Chinese imperial governance, and Wu Zetian's contributions to its development, though often overlooked, were substantial. In the final years of her reign, as she advanced into her 70s and 80s, Wu Zetian increasingly relied upon a small circle of favorites for companionship and counsel. The most notorious of these were the Shang brothers, Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong, young men of exceptional beauty who held enormous influence over the aging empress. Their rise to power and their perceived corruption and arrogance made them deeply unpopular among the established officials and members of the imperial family, who watched with growing resentment as the brothers accumulated titles, honors, and authority. The situation became increasingly unstable as Wu Zetian's health declined, and in the year 705 CE, a group of senior officials and imperial princes staged a coup, forcing their way into the palace, killing the Shang brothers, and compelling the empress to abdicate in favor of her son Zhongzong, who was restored to the Tang throne. The Zhou dynasty that Wu Zetian had founded had lasted just 15 years. She died later that same year, at approximately 81 years of age, having lived through the reigns of 4 Tang emperors and having herself ruled as the only female emperor in Chinese history. In accordance with what appears to have been her final wishes, she was buried beside Emperor Gaozong, her husband, at the Qianling Mausoleum west of the Tang capital. At this tomb site stands a memorial stele, a tall stone pillar of the type traditionally used to record the virtues and accomplishments of deceased rulers. Wu Zetian's stele, however, is blank. No inscription was ever carved upon its surface, and the reasons for this extraordinary absence remain a matter of speculation. Perhaps she believed that no words could adequately capture the magnitude of her reign, or perhaps she preferred to leave judgment to future generations rather than dictate how she should be remembered. Or perhaps those who buried her simply could not agree on what to write about such an unprecedented and controversial figure. What we can say, looking back across 13 centuries, is that Wu Zetian's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of individual achievement within the Chinese imperial system, the extraordinary heights to which ability, determination, and political skill could elevate a person, and the eventual reassertion of the traditional order that her reign had so dramatically challenged. The Tang dynasty continued after her death, entering what many historians consider its greatest period of cultural flourishing, and no woman would ever again claim the title of emperor in her own right, though many would wield substantial power from behind the formal structures of male authority. Wu Zetian remains, across all the long centuries of Chinese imperial history, singular and unrepeated. Her wordless stela standing in silence beneath the changing skies. The city of Chang'an, which today we know as Xi'an, rose upon the plains of central China during the Tang dynasty as perhaps the greatest urban center the ancient world had ever seen. And if you were to stand upon its walls during the reign of Emperor Xuanzong in the early 8th century, you would have looked out upon a planned metropolis of such extraordinary scale and careful organization that nothing in Europe or the Middle East or anywhere else on Earth could rival its dimensions or its sophistication. The population of Chang'an, at its height, has been estimated by scholars at somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, when we include the surrounding suburbs and the settlements that clustered along its approaches, which made it comfortably the largest city on the planet during that remarkable era, a distinction it would hold for many decades until the dynasty began its long and gradual decline. The very existence of such a vast urban population tells us something important about the agricultural productivity, the administrative competence, and the commercial networks of Tang China for feeding and housing and governing so many souls in a single place required systems of supply and management that most civilizations would not achieve for many centuries yet to come. The layout of Chang'an was not the product of organic growth or historical accident, as was the case with so many other great cities of antiquity, but rather the result of deliberate imperial planning on a truly monumental scale. And this planning expressed itself most clearly in the rigid grid pattern that organized the entire urban space into neat rectangular blocks and broad intersecting avenues. The city was divided into 108 residential wards, each one a self-contained neighborhood surrounded by its own walls, with gates that would be closed at night when curfew descended and the streets emptied of traffic and commerce. These wards varied somewhat in size and prestige, with those closer to the imperial palace in the north generally housing officials of higher rank and greater wealth, while the wards further south accommodated merchants and craftsmen and the ordinary working people whose labor kept the great city functioning from day to day. The system of walled wards served multiple purposes at once, for it simplified the task of maintaining order and collecting taxes. It allowed the authorities to monitor the movements of the population, and it gave each neighborhood a certain sense of identity and community within the overwhelming vastness of the metropolitan whole. Running through this grid of residential wards were 11 main avenues of such extraordinary width that they would seem extravagant even by the standards of modern city planning, with some of these grand thoroughfares measuring up to 150 meters across from one side to the other. One must pause for a moment to appreciate what this means in practical terms, for such a width could accommodate not merely traffic and commerce, but also ceremonial processions of enormous scale, with ranks of soldiers and officials and musicians passing in formation, while crowds of spectators line the edges without feeling the least bit crowded or constrained. The central avenue that ran from the main southern gate directly toward the imperial palace was the widest and most impressive of all, serving as the symbolic spine of the capital, along which the power and majesty of the Tang state could display itself to maximum effect. These avenues were paved and drained and maintained by crews of workers whose task was never complete, for the daily passage of carts and horses and pedestrians in such numbers inevitably took its toll upon even the most solid construction. At the heart of Chang'an's commercial life stood two massive markets, known simply as the East Market and the West Market, which between them provided the trading infrastructure for what was almost certainly the most active economy in the world at that time. The West Market in particular had a cosmopolitan character, drawing merchants from across Central Asia and beyond who came to sell the exotic goods of distant lands and to purchase the silk and porcelain and other luxuries that only Chinese craftsmen could produce. Within these market squares, which were themselves the size of small towns, one could find specialists in every trade imaginable, organized into guilds and allocated to particular sections where customers knew they could find whatever they required. The bustle and noise of these markets during daylight hours must have been quite remarkable, though when evening came and the drums sounded from the towers, the merchants would pack away their wares and the gates would close, and silence would settle over the empty stalls until morning came again. What made Chang'an truly extraordinary among the cities of the ancient world was not merely its size or its orderly planning, but its remarkable openness to foreign peoples and foreign ideas. For the Tang dynasty, at its height, pursued a policy of cosmopolitan engagement that welcomed traders and scholars and religious figures from every corner of the known world. Persian merchants established themselves in considerable numbers within the capital, bringing with them the textiles and metalwork of their distant homeland, along with their distinctive customs and their ancient Zoroastrian faith. Japanese monks traveled the difficult sea route to China in search of Buddhist teachings, and many of them settled in Chang'an for years or even decades, studying with Chinese masters and copying sacred texts to carry back to their island nation. Sogdian musicians and dancers were particularly prized at the Tang court, for the peoples of Sogdiana in Central Asia had developed performance traditions of great sophistication that delighted Chinese audiences with their exotic rhythms and their unfamiliar instruments. Arab traders began to appear in growing numbers as the Islamic caliphates expanded their commercial networks eastward, and these merchants brought not only goods but also knowledge of distant lands and peoples about which the Chinese had previously known very little. Among the religious communities that established themselves in Chang'an were Nestorian Christians, whose particular understanding of the nature of Christ had led to their separation from the mainstream churches of the Byzantine world, and whose missionaries had gradually made their way eastward along the Silk Road until they reached the Tang capital. Zoroastrians, who followed the ancient Persian religion of light and fire, built their temples in the foreign quarters, while Manichaeans, who blended elements of Christianity and Zoroastrianism and Buddhism into their own distinctive faith, also found a place within the tolerant atmosphere of Tang religious policy. A census conducted in the year 847 recorded the presence of some 4,000 foreign monks in the capital alone, which gives us a sense of just how significant the international religious community had become. Though this figure surely represents only a portion of the total foreign population. When we consider all the merchants and artisans and servants and others who left no trace in such official records. This atmosphere of cosmopolitan exchange and cultural confidence found perhaps its highest expression in the extraordinary flowering of poetry that occurred during the Tang dynasty, a literary achievement of such magnitude that it has shaped Chinese culture ever since, and continues to be read and memorized and cherished to this day. The numbers alone are quite remarkable, for we possess today over 48,900 poems composed by more than 2,200 Tang poets, preserved in anthologies and collections that were compiled in later centuries to safeguard this precious heritage for future generations. Such productivity suggests that poetry was not merely an elite accomplishment, but something woven into the fabric of Tang's social life, practiced by officials and merchants and monks and courtesans alike as a natural mode of expression and communication. The civil service examinations that selected candidates for government office included tests of poetic composition, which meant that any ambitious young man who hoped to rise in the bureaucracy needed to master the forms and techniques of verse. And this institutional support for literary culture helped to sustain the remarkable efflorescence of the art across several generations. Among the great poets of the Tang, perhaps none is more beloved than Li Bai, whose name is often rendered in English as Li Po, and whose verses capture a spirit of freedom and spontaneity and drunken inspiration that has enchanted readers for over 1,000 years. Li Bai wandered through China for much of his life, rarely settling for long in any single place, drinking wine in extraordinary quantities and composing poems that seemed to flow directly from his intoxicated communion with the moon and the mountains and the rivers he encountered on his travels. His genius lay partly in his ability to make the spontaneous seem effortless, though of course true effortlessness in art requires tremendous skill and knowledge. And Li Bai had absorbed the entire tradition of Chinese poetry before he could transcend it with such apparent ease. The legends that accumulated around his life, including the tale that he drowned while trying to embrace the reflection of the moon in a river, may or may not be true, but they capture something essential about the romantic image that has attached itself to his memory. Du Fu, who was a near contemporary of Li Bai, and in some accounts a personal friend, brought a very different sensibility to his poetry, one marked by social conscience and careful observation, and a deep concern for the sufferings of ordinary people caught up in the turmoils of their time. Where Li Bai celebrated transcendence and intoxication and escape from worldly cares, Du Fu bore witness to the famines and the wars and the corruptions that afflicted Tang society, and his poems often carry a weight of sorrow and moral seriousness that distinguishes them from the more celebratory mode of his contemporaries. Later critics would sometimes call Du Fu the poet historian, for his verses preserve details of daily life and political events that other sources neglect, and his compassion for the common people gave his work an ethical dimension that Confucian scholars of later centuries found particularly admirable. Huang, who lived somewhat earlier than Li Bai and Du Fu, brought yet another distinctive voice to Tang poetry through his Buddhist-influenced landscape verses, which evoked the peace of mountains and forests and monasteries with a stillness and clarity that seemed to embody the meditative states the poet cultivated in his religious practice. The glittering accomplishments of the Tang at its height make all the more poignant the catastrophe that befell the dynasty in the middle of the 8th century, when a rebellion led by a general named An Lushan brought the entire imperial order crashing down and inaugurated a period of warfare and suffering from which the Tang would never fully recover. and Lushan was himself a product of the cosmopolitan Tang world. Born of Sogdian and Turkic parentage on the northeastern frontier, and he had risen through military service to become one of the most powerful commanders in the empire, entrusted with the defense of the northern borders against the various peoples who pressed upon China from the steppes. Emperor Xuanzong, who had presided over the golden age of early 8th century prosperity, had grown old and perhaps somewhat negligent of state affairs, and his infatuation with the beautiful consort, young Gifei, and her ambitious family had created resentments and rivalries at court that An Lushan was able to exploit. In the year 755, An Lushan raised the standard of rebellion with an army of approximately 150,000 troops, many of them hardened frontier soldiers of non-Chinese origin who felt greater loyalty to their commander than to the distant emperor in Chang'an. The rebel forces swept south with terrible speed, capturing the eastern capital of Luoyang and then turning toward Chang'an itself. And Emperor Xuanzong found himself forced to flee the city that had been the center of his long and prosperous reign. The imperial flight took the road southwest toward the province of Sichuan, but at a place called Maowei Station, the escorting troops mutinied and demanded that the emperor execute Yang Gifei and certain members of her family, whom they blamed for the disaster that had befallen the realm. The aging emperor, confronted by the swords of his own soldiers and understanding that his life and perhaps the survival of the dynasty hung in the balance, gave the order for his beloved consort to be put to death, and the strangling of Yang Gifei at Maowei Station became one of the most tragic episodes in Chinese historical memory, commemorated in poetry and drama and painting for centuries afterwards. Xuanzong continued on to Sichuan, while his heir remained behind to rally resistance against the rebels. But the emperor was a broken man, and he would live out his remaining years in melancholy retirement while his son attempted to restore what had been lost. The An Lushan rebellion dragged on until 763, even though An Lushan himself was murdered by his own son in 757, and the fighting spread across much of northern and central China, devastating regions that had been prosperous and peaceful for generations. The human cost of the rebellion and its aftermath can be glimpsed in the census records, which show that the registered population of China fell from approximately 52 million before the rebellion to only 17 million recorded households in its wake. A collapse so dramatic that scholars debate whether it reflects actual population loss or simply the breakdown of administrative record-keeping in the chaos of war. In truth, it was likely some combination of both, for millions certainly died in the fighting and the famines that followed, while millions more fled from devastated regions to places where no census taker could find them. And the Tang state that emerged from the rebellion was a diminished thing, no longer capable of the confident expansion and the cultural brilliance that had characterized its earlier decades. And yet the Tang dynasty continued for another century and a half after the An Lushan rebellion. And during this later period, the Chinese genius for innovation produced achievements that would eventually transform the entire world. The production of true porcelain reached new heights of refinement during the Tang, as craftsmen perfected the techniques for creating vessels of such translucent beauty that they seemed almost magical to foreign visitors who had never seen such material before. And the export of Tang porcelain along the maritime and overland trade routes helped to establish a taste for Chinese ceramics that would persist for many centuries. The technique of block printing, which involved carving text and images in reverse onto wooden blocks that could then be inked and pressed onto paper to produce multiple copies, was developed and refined during the Tang period. And the oldest surviving printed book in the world, a copy of the Buddhist Diamond Sutra dating from the year 868, demonstrates the sophistication that Chinese printers had already achieved by that relatively early date. The discovery that certain combinations of saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal could produce explosive effects was made by Taoist alchemists searching for the elixir of immortality. And though the military applications of this gunpowder would not be fully developed until later dynasties, the Tang period saw the first tentative experiments with incendiary devices and smoke-producing weapons that hinted at the revolutionary potential of this accidental discovery. The Tang dynasty finally came to an end in the year 907, giving way to a period of political fragmentation known as the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. And the great city of Chang'an never regained the splendor and the cosmopolitan vitality it had possessed at the height of Tang power. But the cultural achievements of the Tang, its poetry and its painting and its porcelain and its model of civilized urban life, continued to shape Chinese civilization for all the centuries that followed. And the memory of that golden age remained as a standard against which later dynasties measured their own accomplishments. The foreign monks and merchants gradually departed. The great avenues fell into disrepair, and the 108 wards slowly decayed. But the poems of Li Bai and Du Fu and Wang Wei continued to be read and memorized by generation after generation, carrying something of the Tang spirit forward into times and places that the poets themselves could never have imagined.